Hello friends. This month has been tough for the channel and I need your support. It feels like the videos aren't reaching everyone. Please like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. Thank you, and now let's begin. My name is Cade Whitmore, and I've been a park ranger for 14 years. When the position at Glacier opened up, Remote Station Cavern Lake District, Maximum Solitude, I didn't hesitate. The application was submitted on a Monday. By Wednesday, I had the job. It sounds too convenient, I know. That's because it was. The truth is, I'd been running. My previous post at Zion ended badly. A child went missing on a trail I'd certified as safe. They found her 3 days later, traumatized but alive, 2 miles off the marked path. She kept saying she followed something. She couldn't describe it. The parents didn't sue, they didn't have to. The look in their eyes was enough. So when Glacier called, when they practically begged for someone willing to staff a remote outpost through winter, I took it as an answer to a prayer I'd stopped believing in. The cabin sits on the north shore of Cavern Lake, a glacier-fed body of water so cold that locals say it never truly melts. It's been there since 1987, maintained sporadically. The nearest town, Browning, is 43 miles south. The nearest ranger station is 30 miles east. In winter, those distances become something else entirely. They become walls. My first week was routine. I inventoried supplies, repaired the dock, and documented the wildlife patterns. November at Glacier is beautiful in a way that makes you understand why people die here. The mountains turn impossible shades of gray and white. The sky becomes a single color, neither blue nor gray, but something between them. The silence is profound enough to make your ears ring. I wasn't alone though. Not really. On my 4th night, I found tracks around the cabin. They looked like a mountain lion's, large paw prints, claws, the whole arrangement. Except they formed a pattern that made no sense. The lion had walked back and forth across the porch, across the storage shed, along the back wall, circling the cabin's perimeter maybe 4 times. The tracks were fresh. They'd been made that afternoon, while I was inside reading. A mountain lion doesn't circle. It hunts with purpose. It doesn't pace like something confused. I called the district office. The response came back in an email the next morning, time-stamped 6:14 a.m. Rangers sometimes encounter large predators and unusual behavioral patterns, particularly in autumn when food sources fluctuate. Recommend bear spray on hand and standard precautions. The email was generic. It was also wrong. The tracks weren't from a mountain lion. I should have said so. I didn't. By the 2nd week, I'd stopped sleeping through the night. The cabin is old and loud. It creaks and settles and sighs in ways that new structures don't. Every sound needed investigation. Every shadow required explanation. I'd lie in bed, listening, and wait for the next impossible thing. It came on November 16th. The greenhouse at the back of the property, an old structure, mostly plastic panels and corroded metal, had been locked with a chain. I'd locked it myself. That morning, the chain was off. The door hung open. The greenhouse was empty. Nothing had been taken. But something had been in there. The footprints covered the floor in a chaotic pattern. They looked almost human, but not quite. The heel pressed too far forward. The toes bent at angles that human feet don't accommodate. The person, whatever had made them, had moved erratically, as if learning to walk, testing the mechanics of bipedal movement with uncertainty. I took photographs and sent them to the district office with a message. Possible unauthorized access to property. Recommend check-in. The response was slower this time. 22 hours. When it came, it was from someone different. My supervisor, David Keener, someone I'd never met. We'll schedule a wellness check when weather permits. Are you experiencing any issues that we should know about? Issues. Singular implied. Mental issues. Perception issues. The kind of issues that get people reassigned. I wrote back. Negative, all secure. Apologies for the inconvenience, and I stopped reporting things. That was my first mistake. The lake itself was the issue. I understood that by early December. There was something wrong with the water. In daylight it looked normal, dark blue, cold, vast. But at night, particularly on evenings when the moon was low or absent, the lake developed a quality that I can't properly explain. The surface became active without being disturbed. It moved in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or current. Waves would form and dissipate in perfect geometric sequences, circles within circles, concentric patterns that spread outward and then collapsed inward, only to expand again. I watched it for hours. I'd stand on the dock with my coat pulled tight, breath fogging in the mountain air. and watch the lake teach itself to move in ways that water shouldn't move. One night, I saw something rise from the surface. I want to be precise about this. Precision is all I have left. The form emerged from the water approximately 70 feet from the dock. It broke the surface vertically, as if something was rising from beneath rather than floating. In the darkness, I couldn't identify its shape. I could only see the displacement it caused, the water parting around it. The light from my flashlight reflected against something wet and angular. It made a sound, not a vocalization. A wet sound, like breathing through a mouthful of water, like the sound of skin separating from itself. The noise lasted 4 seconds and then stopped. When I directed my flashlight toward the location, the surface was still again. The geometric wave pattern ceased. The lake became what a lake should be, an inert body of water, cold and dark and dead. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin's main room, shotgun across my lap, and waited for something that I couldn't articulate. Morning came. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. A large fish, a rock slide underwater, the sound of ice forming despite the season. The explanations worked until evening returned. On the 5th night of the lake's activity, I saw the deer. I almost killed her. She walked onto the property around dusk, moving in that specific way that deer sometimes do, cautious but committed, as if already understanding that she was trespassing. She was a young doe, probably 2 years old, with the kind of fluid movement that makes a biologist's heart appreciate evolution. She approached the cabin's south wall and stopped. Then she did something that I'd never seen a deer do. She looked directly at my window. Not in the way animals look at windows. A brief glance, a visual check for threats. She looked at me. She held the gaze. Her eyes were dark and liquid and focused. Then she opened her mouth. The sound that came from her was nothing that a deer produces. It was high-pitched, almost human, almost like a child's cry filtered through a throat that wasn't designed to make that sound. She made it twice, then 3 times, and each repetition seemed to carry more of whatever the other sounds had been missing. Purpose, maybe. Communication. I had the rifle up before I'd consciously decided to grab it. My hands knew what to do even if my mind was still processing. The doe watched me move with the rifle. She didn't bolt. She didn't even shift her weight. The shot would have been clean. I've made harder shots from worse positions. I didn't take it. Instead, I lowered the rifle and watched as the doe turned and walked away from the cabin. She moved toward the lake. She descended the short slope that led to the shore. She entered the water. I expected her to stop. Deer do that sometimes. They wade a few feet and then retreat if the water's too cold. This one didn't stop. She walked into the lake until the water reached her chest, then her neck, then her mouth, which opened that impossible way again, making that sound that was so close to human speech that it bypassed my ears and went directly to the part of my brain that understands prey and predation. She submerged. The water covered her head. She was still below the surface when that movement started again. The geometric waves, the displaced water, the sense of something vast shifting beneath. When she surfaced, 30 seconds later, she was facing the opposite direction. She swam for the shore with a mechanical precision that she hadn't used walking. Her legs didn't move like a deer's legs. They moved like something learning to swim, replicating the motion with accuracy but without understanding. She reached the shore and climbed out. The water poured from her, and she shook, exactly like a dog shakes. The spray went everywhere. I was too far away for it to touch me, but I flinched anyway. Then she looked back at the lake. What happened next was the thing that finally broke something in me. The doe's face shifted. It was subtle, the kind of change you'd attribute to shadows or angle or the failing light, but her jaw unhinged just slightly, and her eyes, those dark, liquid-focused eyes, became something else, something with depths that an animal's eyes don't contain. She looked at my window again, at me specifically, and I knew, with the kind of knowledge that doesn't require proof or evidence, that she was no longer a deer. I left the window. That night, I began writing. I'm not sure why. Some part of me understood that I needed documentation, not for the district office. I wasn't fool enough to think they'd believe any of this, but for myself, as evidence that I wasn't fragmenting into psychosis, as proof that something real was happening, even if that reality didn't match anything in the ranger's handbook. I documented everything: the tracks, the greenhouse, the lake's movement, the doe. I even tried to explain why none of it made sense, which only made the writing longer. Around 3 a.m., I heard the knock. The cabin has 2 doors, the main entrance and a back exit to the storage area. The knock came from the front. It was the kind of knock that you hear in old films, the kind that seems designed specifically to trigger a primal response. 3 deliberate raps, a pause, 3 more. I didn't move. My hand was on the revolver that I keep in the drawer beside my bed. I could see the front door from my bedroom. Nothing moved on the other side of the window. The knock came again, 3 times. I called out, "The ranger station is closed. I'll be available during business hours." Silence. Not the kind of silence where someone is considering your words. The kind of silence that happens after someone stops doing something and waits to see if it worked. Then I heard the sound of something tasting the door. That's the only description I have. There was a wet, exploring sound against the wood, like a tongue moving across the surface, searching for a seam, like something learning how doors work by examining them with its mouth. I aimed the revolver at the door and waited. The sound stopped. The silence returned. The night returned to the particular quiet of the mountains, the absence of human sound that fills with the sounds of wood settling and wind moving through the eaves. At 5:47 a.m., I heard footsteps on the roof. They paced back and forth across the shingles, slow, methodical, learning. They started at the western edge and moved east, then returned to the western edge and moved east again, back and forth, learning the dimensions of the structure, learning what it was. By the time dawn came, whatever had been up there had gone. I didn't eat that day. I sat in the main room and cleaned the revolver repeatedly, checking the ammunition, making sure nothing had corroded or failed. In the daylight, the terror of the night faded into embarrassment. I'd fired no shots, nothing had entered the cabin. Possibly I'd heard something natural, a bear, perhaps, or wind creating sounds that human ears are predisposed to interpret as intentional sounds. Possibly, but the water in Cavern Lake was still moving in those geometric patterns during daylight. I could see it from the porch, circles within circles. A signal or a symptom, I couldn't determine which. The next visitor came at dusk. She was human-shaped in every measurable way. Female. Late 30s maybe. Auburn hair, lighter-colored jacket, jeans, hiking boots. She emerged from the forest on the western approach to the cabin, walking down the slope with the kind of confidence that suggested she knew where she was going, that she belonged. I was on the porch when I saw her. I had time to process her appearance before my nervous system overrode my analytical mind. She looked like one of the day hikers who occasionally ventured to the property asking for directions, except she was clearly not a day hiker, because no day hiker walks that way. Her legs bent at angles that human joints don't accommodate. With each step, her knees seemed to exceed their range of motion by 6 or 7 degrees. Her head remained perfectly still as she moved, no bobbing or adjusting, just locked in place while her body moved beneath it. She stopped about 20 feet from the porch. "The water," she said. Her voice was almost perfect, almost human, almost carrying the kind of inflection that came from someone who'd learned English as a native speaker. Almost. "There's something in the water. You've seen it." I had the revolver in my waistband. I didn't draw it. "I'm going to ask you to leave the property. You asked for this." She tilted her head in that way that humans don't do. The full rotation came from somewhere other than the neck. "You asked to be alone, to be away, to be where things are not as they seem." We answered. "Who is we?" She smiled. The expression was correct, technically, lips turning up, corners of the mouth raising. But it involved too many teeth, or maybe the teeth were normal and the way her face arranged around them was wrong. "The ones that live in the deep places. The ones that have always been in the deep places. The ones that became something else when the water learned to listen." She started walking again. Not toward me. Past the cabin, toward the dock. I moved to follow her, but something in my chest screamed at me not to. Some ancient priority in my autonomic nervous system recognized something that my conscious mind was still trying to rationalize. She reached the dock. She looked at the water. The geometric patterns intensified. The waves formed and reformed in rapid succession. She raised her arms, a gesture that I've only ever seen humans make when addressing crowds or greeting loved ones, and the lake responded. The water surged upward, not a wave, a vertical movement of the entire surface, as if the entire body of water was suddenly trying to stand. The form that emerged was too large. It couldn't have fit beneath the surface, and yet it had. It was vaguely cetacean in shape, but with extra limbs. Or maybe the right number of limbs, but arranged wrongly. It was difficult to look at. My eyes kept sliding off the details, kept preferring the negative space around it to the creature itself. The woman waded into the water. The creature descended toward her. They met at a point that I estimated to be 20 feet out. The water became opaque around the location. I didn't see her emerge again. When the water cleared, the creature was gone. The woman was gone. The lake had returned to its normal state, cold, dark, and inert. I locked myself in the cabin and didn't emerge for 2 days. By mid-December, I'd stopped pretending that anything was normal. I stopped radioing the district office. I stopped recording accurate inventory. I stopped maintaining the illusion that I was functioning as a park ranger. Instead, I observed the things that appeared, and I came to think of them as that. Things, not creatures, seemed to be testing the boundaries of the property. They would arrive at dusk. They came in different shapes. A man with a broken spine that somehow animated his movement. A woman whose skin seemed to be applied wrong, puckered and loose in places where skin should be taut. A child who was clearly not a child, whose proportions were subtly off in ways that made your brain itch. They never attacked, they simply existed in my space. They walked around the cabin, they examined the dock, they touched the greenhouse with fingers that had too many joints. They learned, and each night the lake responded. The geometric patterns grew more complex. The water began displaying colors that water doesn't display, deep purples and blacks that seemed to originate from beneath the surface rather than be reflected from the sky. The sounds from the lake changed too. That wet, breathing quality evolved into something closer to language. Not English or any language I knew, but the phonetic structure was there. Intentional sound, communication. On December 15th, they all came at once. 13 of them, I counted. They emerged from the forest at different points around the property, converging on the dock like they'd planned it. Some moved in ways that suggested human joints. Others didn't bother with that pretense. They crawled. They bent in directions that require flexibility that flesh doesn't possess. They flowed toward the water like they were being drawn by gravity that only they could feel. I was watching from the bedroom window. I'd stopped leaving the cabin entirely by this point. I had 3 weeks of supplies left. I had a revolver with 6 bullets. I had the understanding that I was witnessing something that was carefully, methodically including me in its process. They entered the water in sequence, and something changed in how the lake responded. The water didn't surge upward this time, it invited. The surface became gentle. It began glowing with that internal light. The creatures waded in, and the water accepted them. One by one, they walked deeper. One by one, they submerged. The last to enter was the woman from the first night. The one with the human-shaped body and the face that carried too much intentionality. She paused at the waterline. She turned back toward the cabin, toward my window. She gestured, a clear, unmistakable gesture. Come. I didn't move. I watched her wait. I watched the glow from the lake illuminate her skin. I watched her mouth move, and though I couldn't hear her, I understood the words. It's time. You called for this, the isolation, the forgetting, the place where you could be erased. This is that place. Join us. The selection is nearly complete. Then she entered the water. The glow intensified. The sound became almost musical, a series of tones that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly against the bones of my skull. I should have died that night. By any reasonable logic, I should have. They were in the water. The distance between the cabin and the lake was small. Nothing that wanted to get me couldn't simply enter the cabin and take what it wanted. They didn't. I spent the next 3 days in a state that was something more than shock and something less than sanity. The things had retreated into the lake. The geometric patterns had faded. The water had returned to its normal state. The temperature in the cabin had dropped below 40 degrees, and I'd allowed it to drop rather than start a fire. I didn't want warmth. Warmth felt like collaboration. I understood, on some level that transcended rational thought, that I was being given a choice. The isolation I'd sought had been granted. The place where I could disappear had been provided. All that remained was the decision of whether to step into it or remain suspended between the possibility and refusal. On the 4th morning, I found a deer by the greenhouse. It was the same doe from November. I recognized the marking on her left flank, a stripe of white that ran the length of her body. She was dead, not freshly. The body had begun to decompose. Her eyes were missing. The flesh beneath her throat had been carefully removed, displaying the structure beneath. The anatomical display was precise, methodical, designed to show someone who understood anatomy exactly how the systems fit together. There was a note beside her, written on paper that seemed to have been waterlogged and dried. The handwriting was almost correct, almost formed by human hands, almost legible. This is what you have. Bodies, structures, the mechanics of movement without understanding. We are learning, and when we have learned enough, we will know what you are. We will know how to be you perfectly. We are very close, Cade Whitmore. They knew my name. I burned the note. I burnt it and watched the smoke curl toward a sky that seemed to be watching me back. That evening, I prepared myself. I filled the revolver. I gathered supplies. I made the decision that had been waiting in the edges of my thoughts since I arrived at this remote place. I was going to take the boat across the lake. I was going to reach the opposite shore. From there I could reach the road that led to Browning. From there I could escape. The rational part of me understood that escape was probably impossible, that if they'd wanted to stop me, they would have. That crossing the lake might be exactly what they wanted. The desperate part of me didn't care. I loaded the emergency supplies into the boat. I pushed off from the dock at dusk, when the light was turning that particular shade of gray-blue that happens in the mountains in December. The boat moved smoothly. The motor was reliable. I could see the opposite shore clearly. Maybe 30 minutes. Maybe 40. I made it maybe 15. The water around the boat began to move. Not in geometric patterns, in spirals. Spirals that descended rather than ascended. The boat tilted slightly, not enough to panic, just enough to notice, just enough to feel the pull. "Don't be afraid," a voice said. It came from the water. It came from everywhere. It came from inside my own head with such perfect clarity that I couldn't distinguish between external sound and internal thought. I saw movement beneath the boat. Large movement. The shadow of something vast. The boat tilted again. I made the only choice that was left. I pointed the revolver downward and fired into the boat's hull. The water was cold in a way that cold doesn't adequately describe. It was the temperature of something that wasn't designed to support mammalian life. The cold burned. It froze the air in my lungs. It made thinking impossible. I stayed in the water for maybe 4 seconds before the survival instinct overrode every other consideration and I climbed back into the boat. I was already hypothermic by that point. The boat was sinking. The things in the water were circling. I don't remember pulling myself onto the dock. I don't remember dragging the boat to shore. I don't remember entering the cabin. But I woke in the bed with my clothes drying on the chair and the understanding that I'd been returned. It hadn't been an escape attempt. It had been a test, and I'd passed. On December 20th, winter fully arrived. The roads became impassable. The weather turned in ways that made even the emergency frequency on the radio become a record of gradually increasing isolation. The district office called once more, checking in, confirm your status and whether you require supply drop. I said, negative on supply drop, status nominal, weather is prohibitive for approach. Recommend reattempt in January. They accepted this. Why wouldn't they? The ranger at Cavern Lake was reporting normally. The ranger at Cavern Lake was exactly where he was supposed to be. The things in the lake had stopped coming to the cabin. I understood why. They were finished learning how to move like me. They'd mastered bipedal movement. They'd studied human speech. They'd learned the mechanics of human behavior through observation. Now they were learning the internal experience. That's what started happening in the final days of December. The integration, I called it. Though integration isn't quite the right word. It was more like a series of conversations. They would speak to me from the water. Not with voices, with concepts, images that appeared fully formed in my mind, understandings of how I'd felt when I made certain choices, questions about motivation and fear and the way humans rationalize their survival instincts. They wanted to understand guilt. The guilt that had driven me away from Zion. The guilt that had convinced me to accept a position in a place so remote that help would never come. They didn't understand why humans internalized failure so completely. They found it fascinating. I tried to explain the concept. I found myself explaining it quite well. The shame of failure, the necessity of punishment, the way guilt functions as both motivation and paralysis. They absorbed these concepts like water takes color from ink. One night, about a week before the year ended, they asked if I wanted to enter the water. The question came as a sequence of images. The lake in moonlight, my body moving through the depth, the sensation of becoming something else entirely, a genuine offer, not a demand, not even particularly a threat, just a choice, presented with the kind of clarity that implies there would be no judgment for whatever answer I provided. I told them no. They seemed satisfied by this. The offers stopped. The communication from the water ceased. What remained was silence. On December 31st, I sat on the dock and watched the year end. No fireworks. No celebration, just the mountains turning darker as the light failed, and the water beneath the dock maintaining its surface with the kind of patience that suggests nothing was really happening beneath. I thought about Zion. About the little girl who'd walked off the trail following something she couldn't describe. I'd wondered for 3 years whether she'd been followed by something real or had simply been a child who made a mistake and constructed a narrative to explain it. I knew better now. What I didn't know was whether I'd been sent to Glacier to be destroyed or to be preserved. Whether I was a threat to be eliminated or a specimen to be studied or a tool to be used. The creatures in the water had shown me many things, but they'd never explained their ultimate intentions regarding Cade Whitmore, the park ranger at Cavern Lake. I supposed I would have the rest of winter to find out. The roads would open in spring. Rangers would attempt the wellness check that they'd been promising for weeks. They would find me here. They would find the cabin intact and the supply inventory accurate. They would find a man who could explain everything with perfectly rational reserve. They would find me. And they would never, ever understand why I stayed. Or perhaps they would. Perhaps by spring I would have learned enough to explain it in ways that made perfect sense. Perhaps I would have become fluent in the language of things that live in deep water and learn by observation and understand guilt and motivation better than anything walking the earth could possibly understand. I looked at the water. The moonlight was just sufficient to show the geometric patterns beginning to form again. The learning wasn't over. It would never be over. I smiled, and I waited for the next conversation to begin. I came to Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. Not in the way people usually mean it, though that was part of it. I needed to disappear into something, into a place where the world made sense again through rules I could understand. My career in emergency response had fractured me. Too many calls, too many scenes that lived in the space behind my eyelids when I tried to sleep. The state trooper office offered me a desk job. I refused it. Instead, I applied to the National Park Service as a ranger naturalist at Glacier, Montana. The interview happened in the spring. The supervisor, a weathered woman named Patricia, asked why I wanted to leave a pension track position. I told her the truth. I needed to help people in a place where helping was still possible, where you could find someone lost in the wilderness and bring them home before it was too late. She hired me on the spot. My supervisor was Cade Mercer, a ranger in his late 40s with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades reading terrain. He had Blackfeet ancestry, though he never led with that fact. His eyes were the color of glacial melt, pale and observant. He would teach me the land. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, he'd said during my first week. But they reward respect. That was August. The cabin I rented sat 3 miles from the ranger station at Lake McDonald, the largest lake in the park. It had been built in the 1960s as a ranger residence, and when budget cuts came decades later, it fell into private rental. The owner, a man I never met, had left it largely unchanged. There was a cast iron stove, a pump handle for well water, and a wraparound porch that faced the water. The lake itself was impossible in its beauty, 2 miles long, mirror still in the mornings, surrounded by mountains that seemed less like geological features and more like proof that something ancient and attentive still shaped the world. It was the loneliness I wanted. The first month, Cade trained me on trails, water safety protocols, and wildlife behavior. We practiced what we called bear negotiation, walking through dense forest with bear spray holstered, and our voices steady and deliberate. We learned that elk travel certain valleys at dawn, that mule deer follow ridgelines, that wolverines are both rare and unboundedly aggressive. I learned to read scat, to identify fresh kills, to understand the logic of predator and prey. We also handled the tourists. August was peak season. They came with their phones and their casual disregard for distance. We'd relocated 7 people from the Going to the Sun road that month alone, people who had wandered past warning signs to get closer to bears or cliff edges. Once, a woman asked me if the bear spray was spicy enough to use on her hot dog. In late August, Cade assigned me a sector, the southwestern reaches of the park, including an older trail system that wound through old-growth forest and emerged at Kintla Lake. Low traffic area, he'd said. Good place to learn the backcountry, but respect it. I did. Every day I walked those trails. I learned the smell of the forest at different elevations. I marked dangerous deadfall. I noted where the bears were moving based on their feeding signs. The work was simple and it was clean. At night, I returned to my cabin, filtered water, ate simply, and read. I began sleeping without medication for the first time in 3 years. It was near the end of September when I saw the first deer that didn't match the field guide. I was alone on the Kintla Lake approach at twilight, about 2 miles in. The light was that particular shade of blue-gray that exists only in mountain valleys at the precise moment before dark. I'd been documenting a stretch of trail damage when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The animal stood across a small clearing, perhaps 40 feet away. It had the general shape of a mule deer, with the characteristic large ears and light-colored body. But something in its stance was wrong. Its back legs were locked too straight, the rear haunches held in a rigid posture that no living deer I'd seen maintained. It watched me with an attention that felt directed, not the distracted weariness of prey. I stood still. This is the correct response with wildlife. Wait. Observe. The creature tilted its head approximately 90 degrees without rotating its body. The movement wasn't smooth. There was a jerkiness to it, as if the joints didn't operate on the same kind of fluid mechanics that actually move animals. Its ears didn't twitch. They held position. We regarded each other. I reached for my ranger notes to document behavior. My fingers brushed the pen. The creature dropped and bolted. But again, something was profoundly wrong with the gait. Its limbs worked, yes, but they seemed to have too many angles. The back legs propelled it forward in pulses instead of bounds. It moved like something that had studied how deer run from a distance and was attempting a reproduction of the movement rather than actually running. It vanished into the tree line with a sound like brush being pushed aside by an awkwardly held branch. I didn't document it that night. Instead, I hiked back to my cabin in the dark, something I never did. I moved quickly without being obvious about moving quickly, the way you walk when you sense something and don't want to show that you sense it. The next morning, I called Cade. "Describe it again," he said. We were in the station office, drinking coffee that had been sitting since dawn. Outside, the day was clear, and the lake was the color of old glass. Mule deer. The right body shape. But the proportions were off. The legs were maybe too long. And the movement, it moved wrong. Cade studied me. Movement wrong how? Like it was learning the motion. Like it didn't quite have the biomechanics figured out. I sounded insane. I knew I sounded insane, he nodded slowly. Once, about 6 years ago, I was up near the Canada border, pre-dawn. I saw an elk that had 3 ears, actual ear structures, not a deformity, 3 complete ears on one head, positioned in a triangle. It was maybe 200 yards off. I called it in to biologists. They said I was mistaken. They said I saw something normal and my mind processed it wrong in low light. He set down his coffee. 3 months later, that same sector had 2 hikers lose their dogs. The dogs ran toward something, never came back. What was it? I asked. Don't know. I never saw it again. But I walked that ridge every day that next month. And every single walk, something moved at the edge of vision. Always at the edge. Never clear. My theory, the human brain is very good at pattern matching. It's very good at recognizing deer and elk and moose. So good that it's hard to fool. But something could be deliberately constructed to be almost deer, almost elk. Close enough to trip our recognition, but with enough wrongness underneath that something in us knows there's a problem. So we see it and our brain says deer, but our gut says wrong. He leaned back. I never saw anything clear enough to report. Never saw anything I could prove was anything but regular wildlife. You think I saw something wrong? I said. I think you saw something clear enough for your gut to register wrongness, which means it was close, and which means you should probably not walk that sector alone. The hikers came through on October 7th. I know the date because it's written on the report form, neat capital letters in the space marked "reported missing." They were a family, parents in their early 50s, 2 teenage daughters, from Billings. They'd come to hike the Kintla Lake Trail. The plan was simple: day hike, moderate difficulty, back by sunset. This is what they told the ranger at the trailhead register. This is what their car remained parked at, keys hanging on the proper hook. By 10 p.m. the trailhead ranger called it in. Cade coordinated the response. I was pulled in because I knew that sector. We had 6 rangers available that night plus volunteer search and rescue. It was late autumn, cool enough that exposure was a legitimate concern, warm enough that they probably wouldn't die of cold if they made a shelter. This was the window where lost people were still usually alive. They could be off-trail, the SAR coordinator, a compact man named Gregory, suggested. Saw something they wanted to photograph, lost the trail. Possible, Cade said, but not probable. The Kintla Trail is well marked. We start at the trailhead and grid outward, Gregory decided. Cade asked me to stay near the lake itself. Check the shoreline. People in panic sometimes move toward water, sometimes they follow it out. He didn't need to add the rest. Sometimes people follow water because they're confused and water is the only constant they trust. I took a flashlight and night vision goggles, a satellite phone, and walked the perimeter of Kintla Lake in the dark. The beam of my flashlight created a tunnel of visibility. Beyond it, the world became theoretical. The water lapped softly against shore. I could hear my own breathing and the distant voices of other rangers further back on the trail. Halfway around the lake, I found one shoe. It was a hiking boot, expensive brand, mostly dry. It was sitting on a rock outcropping about 20 feet from shore, as if someone had removed it and set it down carefully. I called it in and didn't move it. Protocol. Within an hour they found the rest. Pieces of clothing scattered in a line that led from the trail down toward the water. A jacket with one sleeve nearly shredded. Torn jeans. Another boot, this one at the water's edge. A fleece vest with something dark staining the back. But no bodies, no people, no blood on the clothing, despite what my mind wanted to insist. The stain on the vest looked dark in night vision, but that could be anything, could be mud. We searched until dawn. The girls' phones were never found. Neither were the parents' packs, water bottles, or GPS devices. What we found was evidence of urgency. We found a trail that led downslope faster than any rational person would walk in darkness. We found torn fabric on low branches, suggesting movement without regard for minor obstacles. By dawn, we called in the county sheriff. By afternoon, it was a potential drowning situation, which meant divers. The divers found nothing in Kintla Lake. They searched for 3 days. The lake is glacially fed and very clear, deep enough that the bottom is easily visible in some places. They found a shopping cart, a bicycle from the 1970s, and no bodies. I was sent back to regular patrols while the investigation continued, but the incident fractured something in me that had started to heal. I understood now why I'd come to the park. I'd thought I was trading constant emergencies for peace. Instead, I'd simply relocated to a place where emergencies arrived with more teeth. By November, there were 2 more incidents, both minor. A group of college students reported feeling watched on the Cameron Lake Trail. They claimed that something had paralleled their route, staying just outside direct sight. One of them had a photo of what she thought was a moose in the tree line. When the image was enlarged, it showed something roughly moose-shaped but with a head positioned at an angle that moose heads do not achieve. A solo hiker reported that a deer had approached his camp at dusk and stared at him for 40 minutes without moving. When he finally looked away and then looked back, it was still there, in the same position. He'd packed his tent in darkness and left. Cade began keeping a field journal separate from official reports. I saw it once when I came to the station for supplies. He didn't hide it. I don't think he wanted to. It was a leather notebook filled with sketches and dates and observations. The sketches weren't good, but that made them more unsettling. They showed animal shapes with proportions that were nearly but not quite normal. Limbs bent at subtle wrong angles, heads positioned in configurations that created a cognitive itch. "This has been happening for longer than you've been here," I said. "Longer than I've been here," he confirmed. "Not constant. It comes and goes. There was a period from 2009 to 2012 where I logged 17 incidents, then nothing for 2 years. Then it started again. Never the same creature twice. Always different enough that no one could build a consistent description. Why hasn't this been documented publicly?" He gave me a look that contained a considerable amount of pity. Who would we tell? What exactly would we say? Strange animals that don't quite match any known species are in the park sometimes. There's a reason government agencies have protocols about information release. Once you report something, it becomes official. Once it's official, it attracts attention. Attention attracts the kind of people who want to prove something, who want to hunt something, who want to validate their conspiracy theories. People deserve to know, I said. People deserve a functioning national park system. People deserve to be able to visit without fear that some cryptid is going to hunt them. He closed the journal. Right now, the incidents are anomalies. They're strange, they're unsettling, but they're not proof of anything except that nature is stranger than we catalog. That's not a press release, that's just reality. I understood his logic. I also understood why he was sitting in the station office with a journal full of impossible animals, looking as though he hadn't slept well in months. November deepened. The park was quieter now, the seasonal employees beginning to leave, the tourists thinning to the hardy few who came for solitude and didn't mind cold. I established a routine, patrolling my sector every morning, returning to the cabin by dark, filtering water and reading by lamplight. I moved through the days with the kind of careful attention people reserve for diffusing explosive devices. Then I saw the deer again. It was near dusk on November 23rd. I was about a mile from Kintla Lake on the eastern approach, documenting a stand of whitebark pine killed by beetles. The light was beginning that shift toward blue. In another 20 minutes, I would head back. The deer emerged from the tree line to my left, and this time I was prepared enough to actually observe it. Its body shape was essentially correct. The tan coloring was right. The ear size and position were correct. But its head moved with a kind of hyper-articulation, joints working in ways that felt excessive. It swung to regard me with a motion that seemed to have too many intermediate positions. As I watched, it took a step forward. Its hind leg moved smoothly. Its front leg followed in a pattern that was just wrong enough to catch the eye. The right back hoof struck the ground without the rebound that hoofed animals have. It was as though the leg was being moved into position rather than propelling a living thing. I did not move. I did not run. I did not take my satellite phone from my belt to call this in immediately. Instead, I stared. The creature stared back. In that moment, I understood something. It was trying to appear normal. The effort was visible in the way it held itself, in the rigid control of movements that should have been fluid. It was a deliberate imitation, imperfect because genuine movement cannot be perfectly replicated by something that doesn't move like that naturally. "You're not a deer," I said quietly. It took another step, then another. Each movement seemed to need to be calculated and executed. It was walking toward me with the speed of something that had learned walking from observation. The deliberation of the movement was the most horrifying thing I have experienced, more so than the strangeness of the shape or the suggestion of intelligence behind the eyes. I moved then. Not from fear, though fear was present. I moved because I understood that this required distance. I turned and walked toward the deeper trail at a pace just short of running. I didn't look back because I understood something else. Being watched meant I was safe. Being not watched might mean the thing had adjusted its strategy. I made it back to the cabin with 20 minutes of light left. I locked the door. I called Coda. "How close?" he asked. 30 feet, maybe less. Did it attack? No. It walked toward me, but each step was wrong. Like it was executing instructions. Like it was trying to copy a gate. "Come to the station. Bring supplies for a week." The station wasn't really a station. It was a rambling facility that had been expanded multiple times since the 1960s. There was a main office, 2 residential units, storage buildings, and a vehicle maintenance area. Coda lived in one of the residential units. When I arrived that night, he was waiting with hot food and an old case file. "You're not the first person to describe that specifically," he said, sliding me a folder from 1993. "Lost hiker. Found 3 days later, about 5 miles from where he was last seen." His testimony was that he saw a creature that was definitely trying to be a bear but wasn't succeeding. His words, he said watching it move was the most disturbing thing he'd ever experienced. He said it was studying him, trying to understand what he was. The incident report was bureaucratic and dismissive. Probable dehydration, possible hallucination. Subject recovered with minor dehydration and exposure injuries. Case closed pending further investigation, which had clearly never occurred. "Why is it trying to imitate animals?" I asked. Coda didn't answer immediately. He was studying me, evaluating something. "I have a theory," he finally said. "There's a phenomenon in predator behavior called luring. Certain predators use mimicry of prey species to bring their target closer. The anglerfish uses a lure that imitates smaller fish. Some spiders mimic insects that other spiders hunt. The wasp that lays eggs in spider abdomens mimics the pheromone of the spider's mate. You think it's using them as lures? I think it's learning. I think it comes to our parks and it studies what humans react to. It tries on different shapes, different gaits. It's testing what will bring us close enough, what it can control well enough to fool us when we're tired or when light is low, or when we're not paying close attention." "That's impossible," I said. "Show me what you know is possible," he replied. Over the next week, Coda walked me through the incidents he'd compiled, not just the ones in the official record, but the ones that had been reported to him or documented by other rangers. A pattern emerged, not in location or time, but in progression. The earlier incidents, from the 1990s and 2000s, were less refined. Hikers reported seeing wrong animals, but the descriptions were vague. Unease rather than specific wrongness. The incident reports were filled with probable explanations. Stress, fatigue, low light. But starting in the late 2000s, the descriptions became more precise. Multiple witnesses could agree on specific details of wrongness. The gait appeared more controlled. The creature seemed to understand chase dynamics better, knowing when to retreat, when to advance. By 2015, there was an incident that matched our missing family. A group of 4 hikers who'd gone off-trail, abandoned their equipment and clothing, and vanished. No bodies. Ever. "Off-trail," I said. They weren't on an established trail, no. But they were tourists following something. 3 of them had photos on their recovered cameras, blurry photos of a deer in an odd position. They kept following to get a better photo. About a quarter-mile off trail, the camera images stopped. What happened to them? The 5th hiker, the one who stayed on the trail, survived. She said she tried to call them back, but they were focused. She said she felt driven, like her body wanted to follow but her mind was saying no. She described it as a compulsion that she had to actively resist. When the compulsion faded, she realized the others hadn't returned. She ran back to the trailhead and reported them missing. They were never found. I wanted to ask more, but Cade had stopped talking. He was looking out the window toward the dark forest beyond the station. Outside, the November night was silent and very still. "I'm bringing in someone," he said finally, "from the university, a researcher who specializes in animal behavior. I'm calling it a normal research project, documenting wildlife patterns and anomalies. But I want documentation. I want evidence that can't be explained away." "Will it help?" I asked. "I don't know. But right now, it's the only thing I can think to do." The researcher arrived 2 days later. Her name was Dr. Carla Voss, and she had the particular kind of intelligence that manifests as impatience with anything she deems inefficient. She set up equipment in the station, motion-activated cameras, audio recording devices, and an infrared thermal imaging kit. She spent her first week reviewing Cade's files with an expression that shifted from skepticism to something harder to name. "You understand that nothing you've documented would survive peer review," she said. "I'm not asking for peer review. I'm asking you to help me understand what's in my park." She was quiet for a long moment. "All right. But if this is going to be legitimate, we need to do this systematically. You need to come out with me." We spent November establishing a grid system around the areas where incidents had clustered. Cade, Voss, and myself, we set cameras, installed audio equipment, and created a systematic observation schedule. The work was slow and repetitive. The nights were cold and increasingly long. Then, on November 29th, we caught something on thermal imaging. Voss had stationed a camera near Cameron Lake, one of the incident zones. The thermal footage showed a large quadruped moving through a meadow at 3 a.m. The body shape registered as warm, which was expected, but the movement patterns were what made Voss stop speaking entirely. The creature was moving in a sequence of positions that seemed to have too many transition states. A normal quadruped moves in an established pattern, but this thing seemed to be holding each limb position for a moment before executing the next move. The motion was geometric and deliberate. "That's being controlled," Voss said quietly. "That's not an animal moving naturally. That's something executing a learned pattern of locomotion." "Maybe the camera is picking up an artifact," I suggested. "Some kind of equipment issue, maybe?" She didn't sound convinced. "I'm setting up a more advanced array, higher frame rate, thermal and visual spectrum simultaneously." December came with snow. The mountains became white and vast and untouched. The park emptied completely. There were maybe 20 employees left, scattered across different stations. The world outside felt very far away. Cade and I continued patrols, but we were looking for something now which changes the experience. You move through the forest differently when you understand that something is observing you with conscious attention. On December 12th, we found another family reported missing. Not on the official record yet, not reported to anyone. Found by a ranger stationed at Glacier who noticed a family's car at the trailhead hadn't moved in 2 days. No one at the cabin they'd booked. No one at the restaurant where they'd had dinner. We found their abandoned clothing near Josephine Lake. Scattered clothing and no bodies, just like before. And near the site we found something else. Scratch marks on rocks, deep gouges that looked deliberate, arranged in almost geometric patterns. Voss recorded everything. She sent the footage to colleagues with careful documentation of what she was and wasn't claiming. Some responded with suggestions of natural explanations. Wildlife experts offered possible alternatives. Cade and I continued patrols. We didn't report the abandoned clothing. We collected it instead. Voss analyzed the material for anything that might explain the disappearances. On December 20th, we observed them directly. We were conducting a thermal survey of a valley near Kintla Lake where 3 incidents had clustered. The night was clear and very cold. We were equipped with night vision and the thermal imaging array. At 2:47 a.m., the sensors picked up movement in the forest below our position. We watched, still and silent, as they emerged into a small clearing. Not just one creature. 3, all roughly deer-shaped, all moving with that same deliberate, calculated gait. They moved in formation, spacing themselves in a pattern that looked almost communicative. What struck me most was their attention. They weren't eating, they weren't drinking from the stream that ran through the clearing. They were occupying space while remaining aware of every detail around them. The way they held their heads, the direction of their stillness, all of it suggested coordination. Voss was recording everything. Coda was very still beside me, the kind of still that comes from complete focus. Then they left. Not in panic, not suddenly. They simply disengaged and moved back into the forest in the same formation they'd held. We hiked down to the clearing and found the scratch marks again. Gouges in the earth, marks on trees. They're mapping, Voss said. They're understanding terrain and distance and how things connect. To what end? I asked. That's the question, isn't it? Coda said. Are they hungry and learning to hunt better? Are they something else entirely, trying to understand a new environment? Or are they trying to understand us? The next morning, Voss sat down at the station office computer and began writing a preliminary report. Not for publication, not for agencies. A report for herself and for Coda and for me. A documentation of what we'd observed that couldn't be filed through official channels because official channels would demand that we explain. And we couldn't explain any of this. I spent that night at my cabin, looking out at Lake McDonald. The water was beginning to freeze at the edges. The mountains were white and silent. I thought about the missing families. I thought about what kind of life they were living now, if they were living at all. I thought about why I'd come here, to a place where helping people meant something real, and what it meant that something was taking people in ways that left no explanation. I also thought about that moment in the clearing when I saw the creature trying to be a deer, the terrible effort it took, the learning process visible in every wrong movement, intelligence in the form of study, predation in the form of understanding. By December 24th, we had made a decision. Voss was leaving. She had sent her preliminary report to 2 colleagues and a university institutional review board, couched in careful language that avoided definitive claims while presenting all documented evidence. By spring, she said, there would be institutional interest and resources. By spring, there could be more disappearances, Coda had said. Yes, she replied. But there will also be outside verification that matters, even if it comes late. When Voss left, Coda and I continued to monitor, now with a plan and with documentation to back us. We increased patrols. We installed additional cameras. We established protocols for what to do if we encountered them directly. The protocols were never tested. In early January, the incidents stopped. Completely. No sightings, no movements on thermal imaging, no more families vanishing in the valleys. By February, the park began to repopulate with seasonal staff. By March, tourists were returning. By April, my temporary assignment ended and the Park Service offered me a permanent position. I accepted. I am still here. I still see the occasional movement at the edge of clear vision. I still find those distinctive scratch marks on rocks after snowmelt, mapped out in careful geometric patterns. But the taking stopped. The creatures, if that is what they are, have learned what they needed to learn. Coda believes they'll return. He's still documenting. His office is still full of sketches and observations. Voss's colleagues are conducting a formal study, authorized but confined to wildlife behavioral anomalies. The official story is that nothing happened, no families vanished, no impossible animals roam the mountains. But I know what I saw. I know what tried to walk like a deer in the fading light. I know what studied me with a kind of careful, deliberate intelligence that was somehow more frightening than any simple predation. I know that something came to Glacier to learn what it could about the way things move in our world. And then it left. Some days, I'm grateful it learned what it needed so quickly. Other days, I wonder what it learned. I wonder if it's teaching others. I wonder when it will return. The lake is beautiful in all seasons. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, that's what Coda said. But I've learned now that mercy isn't always forgiveness. Sometimes it's just the temporary absence of attention from something with patient, deliberate intentions. I am still here. The park is still beautiful. And I still have not learned to be unafraid, but I have learned to watch. I accepted the position as seasonal ranger at Glacier National Park during the lowest point of my life. That's the honest truth, the one I haven't told many people. I was running from something, though not the way most people understand running. I wasn't fleeing trouble or a failed relationship or a foreclosure notice. I was running from myself, from the constant hum of the world that had started to feel like a frequency only my nerves could hear. My name is Marcus, and I was burning out at 42 years old. 15 years working in emergency services in Denver had hollowed me out in ways I didn't fully understand until I couldn't sleep anymore without pills, couldn't look people in the eye without feeling like an imposter, couldn't walk into a coffee shop without mentally cataloging exits and threats. The clinic therapist used words like hypervigilance and CPTSD. I called it done. The job posting for a 3-month ranger position at Lake McDonald came across my desk while I was updating my resume at 2 in the morning. The National Park Service wanted someone experienced with backcountry patrol, wildlife observation, and the kind of work that involved knowing a territory better than you knew your own home. No team rotation, no constant radio chatter, just me, a cabin, and 20 square miles of nothing but forest and water. The salary was laughable, the conditions were harsh, and the nearest town with a grocery store was 40 minutes away. I applied before I could talk myself out of it. The hiring coordinator seemed almost surprised to receive my application. During the phone interview, he kept asking if I understood the isolation aspect, if I had experience with wilderness medicine, if I was prepared for the seasonal shift of animal behavior. He described the job like he was warning me. I heard him offering exactly what I needed. "Why are you interested in Glacier?" he asked toward the end of the call. I should have lied. I should have given him the professional answer about the ecological significance of the park, about wanting to contribute to conservation efforts, about my deep love of the backcountry. Instead, I told him the truth. I need to disappear for a while. There was a pause. Then he said, "Most people who do this job are running towards something, not away from it." "Maybe I'm running towards something too," I said. "Just have to get far enough away to find out what it is." He hired me 3 days later. The cabin sat 2 miles from the lake, elevated enough to catch the morning light but sheltered in a thick stand of larch and spruce. It was built in 1982 and looked it. All dark wood and mineral-stained windows, with a porch that creaked in specific places and a chimney that drafted smoke into the main room when the wind came from certain angles. The solar panels on the roof had been upgraded in 2018, and the water came from a spring-fed line that rarely froze even in winter. For someone trying to step outside of civilization, it was perfect. My supervisor, Diane, came out with me for the first week of my tenure to go over the routines. She was probably in her 50s, all hiking boots and functional clothing, with the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent most of her professional life outdoors. She showed me the radio frequencies, the emergency protocols, the location of the bear canisters, and the wildlife observation logs that I was expected to maintain. "Most activity happens in the early morning and evening," she explained, pointing to patterns in the logbook. "Elk move through the north meadow around dawn. Deer are everywhere. We've had 3 black bears in the area this season, which is normal for summer. The wolves keep their distance from populated areas, but we still maintain awareness." I nodded along, taking notes, my mind already settling into the routine. Early mornings with binoculars and a thermos of coffee. Quiet days in a cabin. Solitude measured in square miles of wilderness. Diane left on a Friday afternoon, following the winding road back toward the visitor center. I watched her truck disappear around the bend and felt something in my chest relax for the first time in months. I was alone, really alone. The kind of alone where no one would interrupt me, no one would ask me if I was okay, no one would expect anything from me beyond showing up and observing the landscape. That first month was everything I needed. I fell into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. I woke at 5, before the light came fully, and took my coffee to the ridge behind the cabin. I watched the world arrange itself below me. Elk moved through the meadows like they had appointments to keep. Deer appeared and disappeared in the tree cover. Eagles hunted over the water. Ravens announced the day. I began to know the land the way I had known the streets of Denver, but with the opposite intention. In Denver, I'd learned to see threats. Here, I learned to see patterns. The water had a rhythm. The wind had a language. The animals had schedules. Everything felt right until the end of the 4th week, when I found the first one. I was doing the evening patrol along the eastern edge of the property, documenting deer activity and checking for signs of disturbance. The path followed a stream that fed into the lake, and the light was that particular shade of gold it gets when the sun is close to the horizon. I was maybe half a mile from the cabin when I noticed the shape beside the stream. At first, I thought it was an elk carcass. We get them sometimes, old animals that don't survive the winter or the sudden temperature shifts of spring. But as I got closer, I realized it was wrong. The shape was there, undeniably, but something about it seemed off in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. It was a deer, that much was clear. Adult size, maybe 180 pounds. But as I knelt beside it, my hand hovering over the matted fur, I realized why my brain kept rejecting what I was seeing. The proportions were subtly wrong. The legs were slightly too long for the body. The spine curved in a way that looked like it had an extra vertebra or two. And the head was the worst part. The antlers were wrong, twisted back on themselves, forming spirals instead of the normal branching pattern. The skull beneath them felt too large for the body, and the jaw was just barely too long, creating a slight underbite that made the teeth visible even with the mouth closed. I documented it in my logbook, my handwriting more careful than usual. I noted the location, the apparent time of death, the lack of obvious cause. No wounds, no signs of predation. The body was in early stages of decomposition, maybe 2 days old, at most. I took coordinates and photos and moved on, trying not to think about how the proportions had looked wrong. That night, I sat in the cabin and researched deer anatomy on my laptop, using the satellite internet connection that barely worked up here. Mule deer, white-tailed deer, black-tailed deer, muntjac, moose. The more I read about normal variations, the more convinced I became that what I'd found wasn't normal. Nothing I read explained the spiral antlers or the proportions. By midnight, I'd convinced myself it was a developmental abnormality, something that happened with inbreeding or nutritional deficiency. These things occurred in wild populations. I logged it as a notable sighting and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found 3 more of them. One was in the meadow north of the cabin, positioned exactly on the trail I used for my morning patrol. Another was caught in the rocks along the stream, its body wedged in a way that suggested it had been trying to drink. The third was floating in the lake, just off the eastern shore, about 30 feet out. I only saw it because I was looking through binoculars to check the nesting area for osprey. All of them had the same wrong proportions. The same twisted antlers. The same subtle wrongness that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on the details. I got on the radio and reported the findings to Diane, trying to keep my voice neutral and professional. Multiple deer mortality in the east sector, at least 4 confirmed. Cause unknown. No signs of predation or injury. Diane's response came back after a moment of static. 4 in 2 days, that's unusual. Could be contaminated water source. We had an issue with blue-green algae last summer. Get samples from the lake. Might be a cyanobacteria bloom. That made sense. That gave the situation a framework I could work with. I spent the afternoon collecting water samples in sterile containers, documenting the pH and color and smell. I found nothing obvious, but Diane's suggestion had given me something to do besides stare at the twisted antlers and think about how the spine of the floating deer had moved like it had extra joints. But that's when the sounds started. It happened on the 3rd night after finding the dead deer. I was asleep, actually sleeping better than I had in years, when something woke me. Not a sound exactly, though there was a sound component. It was more like a pressure, a vibration just at the edge of what I could perceive. Something in the darkness beyond the cabin walls was calling. I got out of bed and went to the window. The moon was 3/4 full, and the landscape was rendered in shades of gray and silver. I could see the meadow clearly from my vantage point, the grass almost luminous in the moonlight. Something moved at the edge of the tree line. In the way of someone trained to observe, I reached for the binoculars on the shelf beside the window and brought them up to my eyes. The magnification caught the shape perfectly. It was a deer. Of course it was. But it was standing on the edge of the meadow, perfectly still, with its head tilted at an angle that seemed to hurt just looking at it. The antlers caught the moonlight in a way that made them look like they were rotating, though I knew that was just the spiral pattern creating an optical illusion. As I watched, it opened its mouth. The sound that came out was not a deer sound. Deer don't have the range. Deer don't have the capacity for sustained vocalizations that rise and fall in pitch the way voices do. This sound was somewhere between a bugle and something else, something that seemed to contain frequencies that were almost below the range of human hearing. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration in my chest and teeth and bones. The call resolved into something almost like language, almost like words, but stretched and wrong, like someone had taken human speech and fed it through a filter that made it undeniably not human. I dropped the binoculars and stepped away from the window. My heart was running, my breathing sharp. When I looked back, the creature was still there, still watching, still standing at that impossible angle with its head tilted almost 90 degrees. This time I didn't reach for the binoculars. I moved to the door and checked the lock, which was a simple deadbolt, utterly inadequate for anything that wanted entry. I grabbed a flashlight and a knife from the kitchen and went back to the window, keeping to the side so I wasn't backlit by the interior light. The deer was gone. I stood there for an hour watching the meadow, listening to the night sounds. Nothing else moved. Eventually, the sound of normal crickets and distant water soothed my nervous system enough that I returned to bed, though I didn't sleep again that night. I lay awake, listening, feeling the weight of the darkness outside the cabin walls. In the morning, I found the tracks. They covered the porch, the area around the door, the foundation of the cabin, all of them deer tracks. All of them wrong. The prints were deeper than they should have been, as if the animal had been applying more pressure than the normal weight distribution would allow, and they converged on the cabin, circling it multiple times before disappearing back toward the woods. I documented everything. Photos, measurements. I marked the locations in my logbook with the kind of precise detail that suggested normality, routine wildlife observation. But my hands were shaking and I couldn't convince myself that any of this was explainable. That afternoon, I got on the radio again. "Diane, I need to report unusual animal behavior regarding the deer in the sector. They're active at night, extremely active. I'm seeing evidence of coordinated movement around the cabin." There was a longer pause this time before Diane responded. When she did, her voice had changed. It wasn't quite concerned, but it wasn't dismissive either. "Coordinated movement? What do you mean, coordinated?" I couldn't explain it in a way that wouldn't sound crazy. How could I describe the feeling of being surrounded, of being studied? How could I talk about the wrong proportions and the impossible vocalizations without sounding like I'd lost my mind? "Multiple animals working as a group," I finally said. "Testing boundaries. Standard predatory behavior, maybe. But from deer." "That's not standard," Diane said quietly. "Deer don't behave that way. Stay in the cabin. I'll check the water samples and send someone up there to check on you. Probably not until tomorrow morning, but stay in the cabin." I assured her I would, and we ended the transmission. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin, checking that the windows were secure, making sure I had flashlights and water, and enough food for a week. By the time the sun went down, I had constructed a kind of fortress mentality, moving through the cabin, checking locks and barriers repeatedly. The sounds started again around midnight. This time there were more of them. More than one creature, that much was clear. The vocalizations came from different parts of the property, creating a kind of horrible harmony. The sound was no longer even attempting to be anything resembling a deer call. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was, in some fundamental way, trying to communicate. And underneath the sound, I became aware of something else. Movement. Multiple sources. The sense of presences circling the cabin, testing every opening, every window, every gap in the foundation. They weren't trying particularly hard to get in. It wasn't the assault of something desperate or hungry. It was methodical. It was patient. It was the behavior of something that was trying to understand the architecture of my shelter. I sat in the center of the cabin, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, and listened to the sounds of the night converge around me. And I understood with a certainty that felt like knowledge directly implanted into my brain, that whatever was happening, it wasn't natural. The deer I had found, the ones with the wrong proportions and the twisted antlers, weren't sick or deformed. They were something else. Something wearing the shape of a deer the way a person might wear a coat that didn't quite fit. The way you could tell the wearer was wrong by subtle indicators of seams and shape. The sounds lasted until dawn. I never saw what made them. When the sun came up, I found more tracks, more evidence of encirclement, more proof that I was no longer alone in my wilderness. That's when I realized the real problem. I had come to this place to be alone, but I had never considered what might also value solitude. Diane arrived with reinforcements at 8 in the morning. She brought a young ranger named Victor and someone she introduced as a wildlife biologist. An older man named Preston who carried himself with the careful posture of someone used to being dismissive of other people's concerns before listening to them. I showed them everything. The dead deer, the tracks, the water samples, the logbook entries. I tried to be clinical about it, using the language of observation and documentation rather than the language of fear. But as Preston examined the first body I'd found, the one still in the meadow, I saw his careful skepticism transform into something closer to uncertainty. "When you say the proportions are wrong," he said, kneeling beside the carcass, "what specifically do you mean?" I pointed out the details. The 2 long legs, the extra vertebrae, the antlers. He examined the skull carefully, his hands moving over the bone structure with the kind of familiarity that comes from years of work. "This is," he began, then stopped. He looked at Diane. "Have you seen this before?" "No," Diane said quietly, "and I've been here for 17 years. "It's not disease," Preston said, his voice taking on an edge of defensiveness. "I've documented plenty of CWD and wasting disease in this population. This isn't that. The structure is fundamentally different. It's almost like the deer is a developmental aberration, But multiple systems would have to be affected to create something like this, and the animal would likely have died in utero or shortly after birth. Yet here's a fully developed individual with substantial muscular development. What about the others? Victor asked. He was younger than me, maybe 30, with the kind of enthusiasm that I had started to understand was the thing separating experienced rangers from experienced people who'd had their enthusiasm carefully burned out. Preston and Diane examined the second corpse, the one from the stream. Then we hiked to where the third body was lodged in the rocks. And finally, we made the difficult hike around to the eastern shore to examine the floating deer with binoculars. Preston used the zoom to study the antler structure and skeletal shape, and I watched his jaw get tighter and tighter. I need to take one of these back, he finally said. I need tissue samples. I need to understand what's causing the developmental changes. While Preston and Victor began the process of carefully extracting the first body for transport, Diane walked with me toward the cabin. She asked me about the tracks, about the behavior I'd observed, about the sounds. I told her everything, not because I believed she would believe me, but because I needed someone else to know that I wasn't imagining it. I described the vocalizations, the intentional circling, the sense of being studied. Diane listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stopped walking and turned to face me. I've been here 17 years, she said. I've seen things I couldn't explain. I've documented animal behavior that didn't fit the textbooks. There's a section of the backcountry about 3 miles north of your cabin, near the ridge, where I stopped going after my third season. The hikers and climbers who come through that area report strange things. Sounds at night, a feeling of being followed, lost hikers who swear they're being herded. In 17 years, we've had 5 missing persons in a 4-mile radius of that area. 5. We found one of them. The others, she shook her head. I stopped going there. I started routing all patrols away from that section. What do you think it is? I asked. I think, Diane said carefully, that this land is older than we are. I think there are things living in the wilderness that we don't have words for. I think they mostly leave us alone, which is fine, and we leave them alone, which is also fine. But sometimes the arrangement changes. Sometimes something decides to investigate. Sometimes we find ourselves in the position of being observed instead of being the observer. The deer, I said. These creatures wearing deer shape, are they? I don't know, Diane said. And I think you should go back to Denver. I think this was a mistake accepting this position. I think the isolation out here, it amplifies things, makes you more aware of things you shouldn't be aware of. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend my decision to take the job, wanted to say that isolation had been healing me. But the truth was, I felt less safe than I had in years. The sanctuary I'd sought had transformed into a trap. There's supposed to be a storm coming in, Diane said. 3 or 4 days from now. Wind, rain, maybe some heavy stuff at elevation. I'm going to recommend we suspend ranger operations until it passes. That means Victor comes back out here with supplies, and we have you shelter in place. Preston needs time to run analysis anyway, and we can decide how to proceed once we have more information. And if something happens while we're sheltering in place? I asked. Diane's expression told me she'd already considered that possibility, and found no adequate response. That evening, after Diane and Preston left, Victor helped me secure the cabin further. He installed additional locks on the windows, reinforced the doorframe, and left me with a satellite messenger that would alert authorities if I activated it. He was trying to be reassuring, but I could see the doubt in his movements. He didn't believe in the threat exactly, but he believed that I believed in it, which was almost enough. Has this happened before? Victor asked as he was leaving. In other ranger postings? You hearing things? Feeling like you're being observed? I almost lied. I almost gave him the easy answer that would preserve his sense of the world as comprehensible and safe. Instead, I told him the truth. Not like this. Never like this. The first night alone after their departure was the worst. I had reinforced the cabin as much as I could with the materials available, but no amount of added locks and checked windows could prevent the sound from entering. The vocalizations started earlier that night, around 10, and they were different this time. There was almost a pattern to them, a rhythm. I began to understand that they were attempting something. Communication, coordination, a kind of language designed to convey meaning across the distance between the forest and my shelter. I tried to resist the urge to understand it. I turned up the radio, covered my ears, focused on anything except the sound. But my brain, trained through years of emergency response to extract meaning from chaos, kept translating, not translating exactly, more like receiving. The meaning appeared directly in my consciousness, not mediated through language. The understanding that they were calling to each other about me, that they were discussing me, that I was a subject of intense interest. Around midnight, something changed. The sounds stopped. The pressure of observation lifted. Instead of relief, I felt a new kind of dread. The sickening certainty that silence in a place meant to be filled with night sounds was worse than any vocalizations could be. I went to the window. The moonlight was bright enough to see clearly, and the meadow was empty. But then I saw them. Multiple shapes moving through the forest at the edge of my vision, not moving erratically or with the typical alertness of deer, moving with purpose. Toward the lake, I grabbed the binoculars and followed them. They moved as a group, single file, and even through the binoculars I could see that none of them moved like normal animals. The gait was wrong. The posture was wrong. It was like watching someone try to operate a biological puppet whose joints bent in almost right directions. They disappeared down the trail toward the lake, and I waited, watching, wondering. After about 20 minutes, I saw them emerge from the trail right at the shoreline. And what happened next is what I've struggled to describe ever since. The thing that made me understand that Diane's suggestion to leave wasn't caution. It was warning. The creatures walked into the water, not to drink, not to wade. They walked in until they were waist deep, then chest deep, then until the water completely covered them. And they didn't come back out. I watched for hours, waiting for them to surface, waiting for them to emerge somewhere else along the shore. They never did. By the time I looked away from the binoculars, the sky was beginning to lighten. I had watched them disappear into the water, and I had come to a terrible understanding. The lake wasn't just water. It was a place where something existed, a boundary, a threshold. I sat on the porch as the sun rose, and I made a decision. I was going to hike to the ridge that Diane had mentioned, the area where 5 hikers had gone missing. I was going to see what was there. I was going to understand what I was actually dealing with, not because I had a death wish or a need to prove my mettle, but because I realized that understanding might be the only currency that had value in this situation. The storm was 2 days away. I had time. I left at dawn on a morning that felt like it was holding its breath. The weather had been clear for weeks, but there was a quality to the air that suggested a change coming. The wind was starting to shift, coming from the northwest instead of the southeast, carrying the smell of distant rain and something else I couldn't identify. I brought minimal supplies: water, knife, flashlight, a notebook and pen, a rifle with a handful of ammunition. Diane's warnings about the northern area were clear, but they were also 17 years old, 17 years of avoidance, which is a long time to let something accumulate in isolation. The hike to the ridge was supposed to take 4 hours one way. The trail started behind the cabin and climbed steadily through increasingly thick forest. After the first hour, I saw signs of the creatures everywhere. Tracks that didn't match any known animal but seemed to overlap with different types of tracks, as if whatever left them was still perfecting the motion, still adjusting the way it moved through the world. There were also markers. Not trail markers, the kind that hikers use, but something else. Branches broken in specific patterns, trees stripped of bark in geometric shapes, stones arranged in lines that seemed to serve no purpose except to indicate direction, drawing the eye deeper into the forest. I followed them. The logical part of my mind understood that this was exactly the thing you're supposed to avoid in a wilderness situation. Deviating from known trails, following unmarked paths, moving deeper into territory you don't understand. The logical part of my mind was being overruled by something stronger, something that understood that I needed to see this through, that turning back would leave me in a state of perpetual fear. The forest became denser. The light took on a greenish quality, filtered through layers of canopy. The temperature dropped. I checked my watch and realized I had been hiking for almost 4 hours, but I hadn't reached the ridge yet. According to my maps, I should have been there an hour ago. I stopped and tried to orient myself. The sun was hidden by the canopy. My compass suggested that I had veered significantly north of the path the trail markers seemed to indicate. When I tried to retrace my steps, I realized I couldn't remember the last clear trail junction. The path forward and the path back looked essentially identical. This was the moment where panic was supposed to set in. This was where a rational person would activate an emergency beacon and call for extraction. Instead, I felt a strange calm, a sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The forest opened into a meadow. It shouldn't have existed according to my maps. There was no marked clearing in this area, no documented alpine meadow. But here it was, roughly circular, maybe 200 feet across, surrounded by trees that seemed to create a perfect fence of green. The ground was covered in grass that looked almost wrong, the color too vibrant, the growth too uniform. At the center of the meadow stood the structure. I don't have a better word for what it was. It wasn't a building in any conventional sense. It was more like a framework, a skeleton made of wood and bone and materials I couldn't identify. Roughly 16 feet tall, wider at the base and narrowing toward the top, creating something like an inverted funnel or an open mouth. The structure was covered with things hanging from it. At first, I thought they were streamers, cloth fluttering in the wind, but as I got closer, I realized they were skins, animal skins, stretched and dried and treated with something that gave them a translucent quality. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all hung from the framework in a kind of grotesque arrangement, moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel, creating a sound like wind chimes made from whispers. I approached the structure, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to run, to do anything except get closer. My feet kept moving. The skins touched my shoulders and arms as I passed through the hanging barrier. The texture was wrong. Organic but too smooth, treated with something that might have been fat or might have been something else. The smell was somewhere between leather and decay, with undertones of something chemical. At the base of the framework, I found artifacts: a boot, a jacket, a backpack, a sleeping bag, a tent stake, scattered items from hikers, items from the 5 people who had gone missing in this area over 17 years. But there was more, much more. Deeper in the items were other objects: an old leather belt, a watch that looked like it dated from the 1970s, a pair of glasses, frame bent and lens cracked, a walking stick with hand carvings worn smooth from long use, a child's doll, its fabric faded and decomposed. Items that suggested the missing weren't limited to the recent hikers. The structure collected things. It had been collecting for a long time. I was so focused on the objects that I didn't immediately register the presence of other people. They stood at the far edge of the meadow, emerging from the forest like they had always been there, like I had simply developed the ability to see them. There were 5 of them, or what remained of 5 someones. They were still roughly human in shape, but the configuration was wrong. They moved with joints bending in almost right angles. Their skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. Their faces were still recognizable enough that I could identify them as human, but only barely. They had that same off quality that I'd seen in the deer, that sense of someone trying to operate a biological form they didn't quite understand. They didn't approach. They simply stood and watched. After a moment, they turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the trees with the same deliberate movement I'd witnessed from the creatures entering the lake. I understood, with a clarity that transcended logic, that I had just seen what happened to people who stayed in the wilderness long enough. They were being converted, changed, remade into something that could exist in whatever this place actually was. I ran back through the skins, ran through the forest, ran with no sense of direction or logic, just the pure instinct to get away from that structure and those not quite people. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the forest floor with no idea how much time had passed or how far I'd come. The forest was quiet. Not the quiet of normal night, but the quiet of held breath, of waiting. I got my bearings as best I could and began to hike. Not toward the cabin directly, but downhill, following water sources, using the techniques that Diane had taught me. It took 8 hours. By the time I made it back to the cabin, it was dark, and the wind was beginning to pick up. The storm was coming. I locked every lock on the cabin door and checked every window. I didn't think about what I'd seen. I didn't think about the structure or the missing people or what the creatures at the lake had been doing. I moved on instinct, securing the cabin, gathering supplies, making decisions based on pure survival necessity. That's when I found the note on my kitchen table. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, like something from a hotel. The handwriting was precise and even, written in blue ink that looked fresh. It read, "We have been here since before the names on your maps existed. We are aware of you. We want you to know that we mean no harm to those who understand the arrangement. Leave by tomorrow. Go to the lake one final time. Walk into the water and keep walking. When you stop walking, you will stop running. You will stop being afraid. You will become something that belongs here. This is not death. This is translation. We have prepared the mechanism for your transformation. All that is required is your acceptance. Come to the water. Let us make you whole." I wanted to convince myself that I had written the note myself, that this was a manifestation of psychosis, that the isolation and stress had finally broken something fundamental in my mind. But I knew my own handwriting. I knew the difference between my thoughts and words written by something else. I locked the door. I didn't sleep. I sat with the rifle across my lap and listened to the wind build outside. The storm arrived with a fury that made the cautionary weather reports seem understated. The wind hit with enough force to bend the trees, and the rain came in sheets so heavy that visibility dropped to just a few feet beyond the windows. The power cut out around midnight. The solar batteries lasted until dawn. After that, I was working by flashlight and the pale gray light that filtered through the downpour. The note sat on my table, and I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. I read it repeatedly, searching for evidence of my own handwriting in it, looking for some explanation that didn't involve the alternative that my mind kept returning to. By the third day of the storm, I had convinced myself that it didn't matter whether I had written it or if something else had written it. The offer was clear: come to the water, accept transformation. The radio crackled intermittently as the storm played havoc with the signal, but one transmission came through clearly around midnight of the second day. It was Diane. "Marcus, we're monitoring the storm. It's worse than predicted. I'm going to have to recommend that you shelter in place for at least another 24 hours. The ridgelines are unsafe. We've had mudslides reported on the northern approach. Just sit tight. We're keeping watch." I told her I was secure and well supplied, which was true. What I didn't tell her was that the security of the cabin suddenly felt like the opposite of safety. The reinforced doors and checked windows weren't keeping anything out. They were keeping me in. On the third night of the storm, I made my decision. I gathered what supplies I could carry in one pack. I left a note for Diane explaining that I had decided to attempt a hike out early, that I had decided the ranger position wasn't suitable for me after all. I made it appear as though I was concerned about supplies running low and had decided to take my chances with the storm rather than wait. It was a message designed to explain my disappearance in the terms she would expect. Then I changed into waterproof gear, checked the rifle one more time, and opened the door. The wind tried to knock me off the porch. The rain stung like needles. The world had reduced itself to a tunnel of gray and chaos, but I could navigate it. I had spent my career moving through dangerous situations. I could move through a storm. I hiked toward the lake. The path was barely visible in the rain and darkness, but I found it anyway, guided by the sense of rightness that had emerged when I saw the structure in the meadow. When you surrender to a place, that place begins to guide you. When you stop resisting, the pathway becomes clear. It took an hour to reach the shoreline. The water was wild, churned white with rain and wind. The normal calm surface of Lake McDonald had transformed into something aggressive, something that seemed to want to expand beyond its normal bounds. I stood at the edge of the water and looked back toward the land one final time. Then I began to walk into the lake. The water was cold enough to burn, but I expected that. What I didn't expect was the sensation of being welcomed. The further I walked, the more the water seemed to part for me, as if anticipating my movement, preparing the way. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, dozens of them, moving in the synchronized pattern I'd seen the creatures use when they approached the cabin. The rain hammered down, the wind screamed, and I kept walking. When the water was chest deep, I stopped. The transformation was supposed to begin now, according to the logic of the situation, but instead I felt a clarity sharper than I'd experienced in years. I had come out here running from myself. I had come to this wilderness looking for isolation and found something far stranger. I had been offered a choice: stay human and afraid, or become something that belonged to this place. But there was a third option, the one that occurred to me as I stood in the black water with the storm raging around me. I could simply stop running. I turned away from the deeper water and waded back to shore. The shapes beneath the surface followed me briefly, then faded, as if they understood that I had made a decision they didn't expect. I walked out of the lake, soaked and freezing, and began to hike. Not back to the cabin, not toward the structure in the meadow, not deeper into the wilderness where the creatures had taken the other hikers. I hiked toward the southern boundary of the property, toward the trail that would eventually lead to the main park road, toward civilization and answers and a world that used words like insanity and stress-induced psychosis to explain things that didn't fit into convenient categories. I was still hiking when the sun rose on the fourth day. The storm had broken. The air smelled clean. My clothes were still damp, but my resolve was dry. The ranger station found me on the park road, roughly 6 miles from the cabin. I was hypothermic and dehydrated, but otherwise functional. Victor picked me up, wrapped me in blankets, and asked if I was all right. I told him I had developed severe anxiety about being alone and decided to hike out early. He seemed relieved to have an explanation. Diane recommended that I return to Denver for evaluation. I accepted the recommendation without argument. The ranger position was terminated, with the understanding that mental health leave was necessary. I didn't argue about that either. The cabin was thoroughly examined for signs of disturbance. Nothing was found. The locks were intact. The reinforcements I'd made were inspected and deemed reasonable precautions for someone experiencing anxiety in an isolated location. The note on my kitchen table was never found, and when I tried to describe it to Diane, she listened with the kind of careful attention someone uses when they're monitoring a statement for signs of delusion. Preston's analysis of the dead deer never produced results. The tissue samples deteriorated before they could be properly analyzed. He attributed this to improper preservation given the difficult conditions. The structural abnormalities remained unexplained, attributed to developmental variation or genetic anomaly. The 5 missing hikers remained missing. No new leads emerged. The area continued to be noted as difficult terrain with challenging conditions, and routine patrols still avoided the northern ridge. I returned to Denver and underwent a series of evaluations. The therapist noted that I had experienced significant trauma and that isolation had exacerbated my pre-existing hypervigilance responses. They used terms like dissociation and stress-induced false memories. They prescribed medications and recommended against any future remote work postings. Over the course of 4 months, I reintegrated into society and back into the semblance of a normal life. The vivid memories of Glacier began to lose their sharp edges, became more dreamlike, more deniable. But I keep the information. I have detailed notes on the structure in the meadow, the specific locations of the creature activity, the coordinates and timing of sightings. I have photographs of the dead deer, though I've never shown them to anyone. And I have the understanding that there are places on this earth where the human understanding of biology and behavior is incomplete, where arrangements exist that operate under different rules. I return to emergency services work, but part-time now. Most of my life exists in quiet routines, in spaces where I can observe without being observed. And I have spent the last 3 years carefully studying the folklore of the regions where hikers disappear, where trail conditions are reported as impossible to navigate, where search and rescue operations find no evidence of human presence despite the density of missing persons reports. Glacier National Park appears in at least 17 different variations of folklore. The creatures that people report aren't always the same. Sometimes they're described as anomalous animals. Sometimes they're described as not quite human people. Sometimes they're described as things that don't have clear categories. But the pattern is consistent. The missing people are always missing in specific areas. The reports always describe a sense of being herded, guided towards something. The transformation always happens away from human observation, in places that don't appear on official maps, in structures built by something that has been collecting human items long enough to understand their significance. I will never know if what I experienced was real in the way we normally use that word. I will never have confirmation that the creatures were anything other than the product of an exhausted mind pushed beyond its limits. I can provide no evidence that would convince a skeptic, no proof that would satisfy a scientific mind, but I know that I was offered something. I know that I made a choice, and I know that if I ever returned to that place, if I ever stood on the shore of that lake again, there would be a mechanism waiting for me. Something would be ready. The arrangement would still be open. Every few weeks, I receive emails from unknown senders. They contain photographs of places I don't recognize. Forests, mountains, lakes, all with subtle signs of habitation, structures barely visible in the background, shapes that might be people but probably aren't. And each message contains the same simple text: when you are ready. I delete them. I block the addresses. But the messages keep coming, and I keep receiving them, and I keep understanding that there are places where humanity and whatever comes before or after it exist in a careful negotiation. Most people live their entire lives without seeing behind that arrangement. But once you've seen it, once you've been offered membership in a club you didn't know existed, the invitation never quite stops arriving. I accepted the ranger position because I was running from myself. But I didn't stay in the mountains because of the isolation. I didn't stay because I found peace. I stayed because I found something that understood me, that wanted me, that offered a belonging more fundamental than anything civilization could provide. The only thing more terrifying than the existence of that place is the knowledge that someday I might find myself wanting to say yes. I took the job because I needed to disappear, not in the way people usually mean it, though I suppose there's some truth to that too. I took the Glacier National Park Ranger position at Clearwater Basin Station because the application asked fewer questions than other parks, The hiring officer, a tired-looking woman named Beverly, didn't push when I left the previous employment section mostly blank. She needed bodies for the remote stations. I needed a place where nobody would look for me. I was assigned to Clearwater Basin in late August, a cabin nestled at 6,200 feet elevation where the forest turns old and the trails get sparse. The cabin itself was a solid-built 1970s structure with a cast-iron stove, a working pump, and a radio that crackled with the voices of rangers from stations I'd never reach by foot. The lake beyond it was glacial-fed and cold enough to kill you in minutes. I had read the ranger's manual cover to cover before I arrived. I wasn't running from the law. I was running from a person, which in some ways is worse. The first month was ordinary. I marked trails, cleared deadfall, checked bear boxes at trailheads, and filled out the endless paperwork that comes with the job. I processed hiking permits, most of them digital now, and watched the weather. Autumn in Glacier moves fast. The aspens turned gold by early September, and by late September the higher elevations started seeing snow. I liked that about the work. The seasons don't care about your problems, they just turn. My nearest colleague was another ranger stationed at Many Glacier, about 18 miles north. We radio checked twice a day. Once a week I'd drive the mountain roads to the ranger station at headquarters for supplies. The rest of the time I was alone with the mountain. This is important, I think. Understanding that I was truly alone up there, cell service didn't exist, the radio worked on scheduled channels. If something happened to me on the trail, rescue would take hours at best. This detail matters for what came later. The first real incident happened in late October. I was doing a routine loop trail inspection, the 3-mile circuit near Clearwater itself, checking for erosion and marking sections that needed work. The forest here was dense. Lodgepole pine and white bark above the lower elevations, the canopy so thick that even at noon the light came down in cathedral rays. The ground was soft with decades of needles. My boots made almost no sound. I was maybe 2 miles in when I saw the deer. This isn't unusual. Glacier has a healthy mule deer population, and seeing 3 or 4 in an afternoon is normal. But this herd was larger than usual, maybe 12 animals, and they were standing perfectly still in a clearing, all facing the same direction. Not grazing, just watching something I couldn't see. I stopped. Ranger training says don't approach wildlife, maintain distance. I was maintaining it. I watched them for maybe 5 minutes. They didn't move. The afternoon was quiet. No wind, which is unusual at elevation. The deer never looked at me, though I was in plain sight. They kept their attention on something deeper in the forest, something beyond the tree line I couldn't penetrate. Then one of them walked forward, slowly, not the natural gait of a mule deer, which is that distinctive bouncing motion. This one moved like something thinking about how legs work, testing each placement carefully. It walked directly away from the herd toward a dense section of pine and just stopped. The others followed, one by one, in the same measured, deliberate way. I marked it in my notes as possible wolf activity in the area, deer behavioral changes, possible predation pressure, but even writing it felt dishonest. I knew what I'd seen wasn't normal. The second incident was 5 days later, same trail, similar location. This time I saw just one deer, standing in the middle of the path. As I approached, keeping a good distance, I realized something was wrong with its proportions. Its legs were too long for its body, in that stretched, distorted way optical illusions sometimes have when you're tired. It had the head of a mule deer, ears and all, but the body seemed too thin, too angular. As I stepped closer, it turned to look at me, and I stopped moving. The eyes. Deer eyes are dark, wet, almost liquid. This animal's eyes were dry, or seemed to be. They didn't reflect light the way they should. When it finally moved, it didn't bound away. It walked, again with that deliberate testing motion, back into the trees. I radioed headquarters that evening, told the dispatcher about unusual wildlife activity, possible injury or disease in the deer population. She said to note it and keep watch, nothing urgent. I didn't tell her about the way the thing moved. I didn't tell her that it had looked at me with an intelligence that made my hands shake during the radio transmission. By early November, I'd seen more of them, not always on the trails. Sometimes from my cabin window in the early mornings, they'd be at the forest edge where the meadow opens toward the lake. Always the same behavior, motionless, that stretched physiology, the way they moved when they finally did, like animals learning locomotion for the first time. I started researching. The cabin had a small reference library. A few field guides, mostly outdated. I found a guide to mule deer that explained normal behavior, antler development cycles, seasonal movement patterns. None of it applied to what I was seeing. I pulled up the radio frequency archives, old ranger reports going back to the 1980s, scattered mentions of unusual deer and behavioral anomalies, but nothing concrete, nothing that named what I was seeing. The first hiker in 3 weeks came through around mid-November, a solo woman in her mid-60s, doing the circuit to Clearwater and back. I processed her permit and she seemed normal, fit, well-equipped, friendly small talk. She headed out early morning with a return time marked for that evening. When she came back down the trail around 3 p.m., she was moving fast, not hiking, running. She made it to the permit station where I was doing equipment inventory, and she was breathing hard, face flushed. "There's something wrong with the deer up there," she said. At the meadow crossing before Clearwater, I already knew what she'd seen, I think. Some part of me did. "What do you mean, wrong?" I asked, though I was already closing my notebook. She had trouble articulating it, kept using words that didn't quite fit. They didn't look right, the way they were shaped, and they were just standing there, all of them, and when I tried to pass, they didn't run or anything. They just turned and watched me, all at once, like they were connected somehow. I radioed it in as a wildlife concern and reported that she'd cut her hike short due to discomfort. She drove down the mountain that same day. I never saw her again, but I got a report from the ranger station that she'd called and asked to file a formal complaint about hazardous wildlife conditions at Glacier. They filed it. Nothing came of it. The real problem began when I found the first body. It was November 12th, and there had been snow, unexpected and heavy, 8 inches in one night. I was clearing snow from the main trail and the access road, cursing the early season and planning a supply run to town, when I found it in the meadow east of the cabin, a mule deer, but wrong in a way that made me approach it very carefully. The body was intact, no predation marks, no obvious cause of death that I could see. But it wasn't decomposed. It was frozen, obviously, but when I touched it with a stick, the fur was wrong. It was matted, and underneath the matting, the skin was thin, almost translucent. The legs were that same impossible length I'd seen on the living ones, as if they'd stretched in death. Most disturbing was the inside of the mouth. The jaw was slightly open, and I could see the dental structure wasn't quite right. The teeth were more human than ungulate, with a grinding quality that mule deer don't have. I marked the GPS location and radioed it in as a wildlife carcass disposal issue, requesting guidance. The response took 6 hours. When I finally got someone on the radio, it was a supervisor I'd never spoken to before. She told me to dispose of it by burying it far from the water line and water sources, standard procedure. I did that, and filled in the report form. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 4 more. Each one showed the same impossible anatomy. Each time I disposed of it and filed the report, I stopped mentioning the abnormalities. No point. Then I found the remains of the tent. It was on the north side of Clearwater Lake, in a spot where overnight camping is technically illegal, but hikers do it anyway. The tent had been shredded, not torn by wind or by bears, which is what I'm trained to recognize. This was something else. The fabric was ripped in a way that suggested force without intention, like something very strong and very stupid had torn it open. The contents were scattered. Sleeping bag, clothing, food stores, a journal, and blood. Old blood, weeks old at least, based on the color and the way it had oxidized on the nylon. I should have called for backup. I should have radioed it in immediately. Instead, I sat on the shore of Clearwater and tried to think about what I was looking at. The blood wasn't enough to suggest a person was dead, but it was enough to suggest someone had been hurt. I picked up the journal with shaking hands and opened it. The handwriting was frantic, deteriorating across 3 pages. The first entry was dated 6 weeks prior, early September. A hiker, someone named Marcus, documenting a solo trip through the park. The writing was normal at first, descriptions of views, weather, wildlife observations. Then, "The deer are wrong, I can't explain it better than that. Saw a group in the meadow, they stood there staring at me for maybe 10 minutes. The proportions are all off, like someone took a normal deer and stretched parts of it. I'm probably tired, probably seeing things. Moving camp tomorrow." The next entry was 3 days later. "They followed me. The group from before, I first noticed them at the meadow crossing. Then I saw them again an hour later, still heading the same direction I am. One of them has been watching me camp. Every time I look up, it's standing at the tree line. I tried yelling at it, it didn't move. It just watched." The final page was the worst. "It came into the camp last night. I woke up and it was just there, standing over the tent, and its face was at the nylon, and I could hear its breathing, or something breathing. This morning it was gone, but it came back at dusk. The thing that bothers me is it isn't hunting me, it isn't trying to hurt me. It's just, Observing, like I'm something it needs to understand. I'm going to try to reach the trail tomorrow morning. I have to get out of here. Something is very wrong with these animals. That was the last entry. I burned that journal in the cast iron stove. The rational part of my mind told me I should report it. The irrational part, the part that had been growing stronger since September, told me that reporting it would bring attention I couldn't afford. Scrutiny, questions about whether my judgment was sound, whether I could be trusted. I'd come to Glacier to disappear, and this disappeared me in a different way. I disposed of the tent materials as I disposed of the bodies. Buried everything that could identify Marcus except his actual remains, which I never found. Then I went back to my normal routine and tried not to think about it. But the things were thinking about me. That's the only way I can describe what happened next. I would see them watching. The cabin has windows on all sides, and I started noticing movement in the tree line. A shape would appear and it would stay, for hours sometimes. I'd be reading or doing paperwork and I'd look up and there would be one just standing at the edge of the clearing, absolutely motionless. When I looked directly at it, it wouldn't run. It would just wait until I looked away, and then it would be closer. In late November, I stopped trying to convince myself they were natural. The thing that finally broke through my denial was a night when one of them came onto the cabin's porch. I was asleep when I heard the sound, a soft, deliberate testing of the boards, the nails creaking. I woke up and lay absolutely still, listening. The sound moved around the porch, testing different spots, finding the weak points in the structure. Then it came to the window by my bed. The light was almost full moon, and I could see its silhouette against the glass. The shape was wrong, the head too large, the body too elongated. The profile of the face was almost avian in its proportions. I stared at it, and it stared in, and I had the distinct and horrible impression that it was trying to solve the problem of glass, understanding what this transparent barrier was and how to penetrate it. I got up and turned on every light in the cabin. Went to the kitchen and made coffee and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking. By morning, it was gone. I radioed headquarters and reported suspicious activity near the station, possible bear attempting entry. The dispatcher said to secure my supplies and monitor the situation. We left it at that. December brought the answer I didn't want. A park historian, Dr. Something, I didn't catch the full name, came through as part of a regional research initiative. She was cataloging old ranger reports and historical anomalies, and somehow my reports had flagged her attention. She came to the cabin with a folder of documents spanning back to 1952. Has anyone mentioned the Watchers to you? She asked, not bothering with preamble. I said no, though something in my chest dropped. She spread out reports. Dozens of them, from different rangers, different decades, all describing the same thing I'd been seeing. Animals with impossible proportions. A herd behavior that seemed coordinated. No aggression, just observation. The reports dated back to before the park's official establishment, recorded in the diaries of early settlers in the area. The indigenous people called them something we can't quite translate, she said. The closest meaning is something like, the things that watch to understand. There are stories suggesting they've been here far longer than the park has existed. They seem to prefer the remote basins, particularly Clearwater. What are they? I asked. We don't know. We have theories, but nothing concrete. They're not documented anywhere in scientific literature. The prevailing hypothesis is that they're a remnant population of something prehistoric, adapted to avoid human detection. Or they could be something else entirely. She wanted access to my recent reports, my observations. I gave her edited versions. Removed the references to the tent, to Marcus, to the deliberate intelligence in their behavior. She didn't push. She seemed to understand something without me saying it. Before she left, she told me something that I've been unable to stop thinking about. The rangers who stay longest at remote stations tend to report the highest number of sightings. But the ones who try to document everything, who try to understand them systematically, those rangers usually leave within 6 months. They can't handle the implication. The implication that they're studying us, that we are the subjects, that from their perspective, our behavior and our patterns are what they're trying to understand. It's mid-December now. I haven't seen any of them for 5 days. That's worse than when I was seeing them constantly. The absence creates a different kind of dread. I find myself watching the tree line during daylight, searching the darkness during night. Part of me wants to set up cameras, gather evidence, prove what I've experienced. The rational part of me understands that the moment I do that, I'm declaring to the world that I've spent months of my life documenting things that shouldn't exist. The job posting for the Clearwater Basin Station will open again next August. I'm submitting my resignation in the spring, not because I'm frightened, though I am, but because I finally understand why the previous ranger lasted only a year before requesting transfer. Once you know you're being studied, you can't go back to not knowing. Sometimes I sit on the cabin porch on clear nights and look out toward the meadow where I first saw them. The moon lights up the snow and the pine, and somewhere out there, I know they're watching. Not with malice, just with that cold, patient, methodical intelligence that wants to know what I am, how I think, why I came here to hide from something human, only to find something else. Marcus was looking for answers in his journal. He was trying to document and understand. That's what got him. I'm doing the opposite now. I'm trying very hard not to understand. I'm trying to exist in the space where the knowledge sits but doesn't process, doesn't calcify into something that changes who I am. But it's getting harder. The snow is coming thicker now. By January, this place will be nearly impossible to reach without a snowmobile. I could request evacuation, medical leave, a transfer to anywhere else in the national park system. But there's something in that patience I see in the forest, something that suggests they expect me to run, and running is what they're studying. What happens to a human when they know they're being watched? How long until the watching becomes a conversation? I haven't answered yet. But I think the winter is going to be long enough to find out. The radio crackles beside my bed. Tomorrow it will be time to check in. I'll tell them everything is fine. The station is secure, no major incidents, just another day in the remote wilderness where the air is thin and the solitude is almost complete. And in the trees, something will listen to the transmission. It will understand that I'm lying, and it will continue its work, patient and methodical, trying to solve the problem of what I am. My name is Raven Moss, and I've been a backcountry ranger for 16 years. Most people assume I took the job for the beauty of it, the mountains, the pristine lakes, the solitude that comes with defending one of America's most unforgiving territories. That's partly true, but the real reason I accepted the position at Glacier National Park 5 years ago, specifically the remote section around Heaven's Peak and Spirit Lake, was because I needed to disappear. I'd worked in Yosemite before, spent my 20s watching climbers attempt the impossible while I reported on loose rock and avalanche patterns. Good work, honest work. But somewhere between the 10th near-death experience I'd documented and the bureaucratic machinery that swallowed every report I filed, I lost something. Not my faith in the wilderness that remained intact, maybe grew stronger. What I lost was my patience for civilization. The transfer papers came through in March. My supervisor at Yosemite seemed relieved. I didn't ask why. The assignment was straightforward. Monitor the northern reaches of Glacier, maintain the 2 ranger stations, conduct weekly patrols, document wildlife activity, and respond to emergencies in a territory that covered roughly 400 square miles of genuine wilderness. We're talking about the kind of landscape where rescue operations can take 12 hours just to reach you, where cellular service is a fantasy, and where the nearest hospital is across state lines. The cabin at Spirit Lake became my primary station. It sits on the western shore, about 8,000 feet of elevation, roughly 15 miles from the nearest maintained trail. Access is by foot or pack horse in summer, snowmobile in winter, and by helicopter only if someone's literally dying. The previous ranger had lasted 7 months. The one before that, 2 years. They'd both requested transfers without explanation. When I asked about their departures, the park superintendent just shrugged and said some people can't handle the isolation. That isolation was exactly what I wanted. I arrived in late June, when the snow had retreated to the highest peaks and the wildflower meadows below Heaven's Peak burst in purple and gold. The cabin was solid. Built in 1987, renovated in 2009, maintained well enough that the roof didn't leak and the stove actually heated the main room. A sleeping loft, a small kitchen, an office area with a radio and satellite phone. Large windows overlooked the lake, which stretched north toward glaciers that had slowly been disappearing my entire lifetime. The lake itself was remarkable. Clear enough that you could see boulders 30 feet down, cold enough that exposure meant death in 20 minutes. No fish. This had always bothered previous rangers, I think. A Montana lake that couldn't be fished, couldn't be easily accessed, couldn't serve any recreational purpose. To them, it was dead water. To me, it was perfect. July passed without incident. I established a routine: morning coffee watching the shore while light filled the valleys, midday patrols of the perimeter trails, evenings spent reading or maintaining equipment. I logged 17 elk sightings, documented a grizzly bear den that was active but appropriately far from human territory, and recorded the expected volume of radio traffic from other stations. There was one anomaly in early July, a call from a backpacker named Morrison who'd gotten lost 2 miles south of Gunsight Pass. His last known location was compromised by weather and topography. I spent 14 hours finding him sheltered against a rock overhang, hypothermic but alive. The operation went textbook. Medevac helicopter met us at a prepared landing zone. I filed the report and moved on. The lake was quiet, almost too quiet. I'd worked wilderness long enough to understand animal behavior, the seasonal rhythms, the expected patterns of sound, but Spirit Lake seemed to exist in its own acoustic vacuum. Birds called to each other in the high passes, but rarely over the water itself. The shoreline, which should have been marked with animal tracks during the wet dawn hours, remained strangely clean. The only consistent prints were mine. By late July, I'd noticed something else. The water itself seemed different. On the calmest mornings when the surface should have been like glass, small ripples moved across the expanse without any wind to generate them. Just subtle circles, originating from different points, moving across the water with no visible source. I watched for hours from the cabin trying to identify the cause. Fish jumping didn't create that pattern. Wind, even gentle wind, would push water differently. These ripples moved with an almost mechanical precision, as if something beneath the surface was deliberately creating them. I documented it in my log. Unusual water activity, possible seismic microactivity. The park geologist's preliminary response was dismissive. No fault lines in that region. Probably seeps and underwater springs reaching saturation point, harmless. August brought the first real complication. I found the deer on a Tuesday morning, about a mile up the trail that curves around the western shore. At first, I only registered that something was wrong with the landscape, a shape that didn't belong, too pale, too still. As I approached, I realized it was a mule deer doe, maybe 200 pounds of animal, standing absolutely motionless in a thicket of pine saplings. This in itself wasn't alarming. Animals freeze when they sense threats. But this doe didn't have eyes that registered my presence. I could see its dark eye from 20 feet away, and I could swear it was fixed on something beyond me, beyond the tree line itself. Its flanks were heaving, rapid, shallow breathing, the kind that indicates genuine distress. And there was no visible injury, no wounds, no bleeding, no obvious predator marks. I backed away slowly, giving the animal space. It didn't move. I returned with binoculars an hour later, and it was still standing in the same position, in the same thicket, breathing in that panicked pattern. By the next morning, it was dead. I found it in the same location, already drawing attention from a raven and something larger, maybe a coyote that scattered as I approached. The body showed no signs of predation. The doe hadn't been partially eaten or dragged. It was simply lying there, empty, collapsed as if its animating force had just ceased. I logged it. Possible disease vector, possible stress response to predator presence. I noted the location and increased my patrols of the south boundary. That Friday, I found another, an elk calf, impossibly far from its mother, standing on the frozen inlet of the lake itself, staring toward the deeper water. This time, I called in a veterinary biologist from the regional office. By the time she arrived by helicopter Saturday morning, the calf was gone. Not dead, gone. We found tracks in the mud, fresh hoof prints that led to the water's edge, and simply ended. No body in the water, no signs of predation, no indication of where the animal had gone. The biologist ran every test she could perform on the surrounding area. Toxins, disease markers, environmental factors. Everything came back negative. It probably went into the water, she concluded, though I could tell she didn't believe it. Hypothermia would set in quickly. The body might have sunk or been swept downstream despite the lack of current. I nodded and said nothing. That night, standing at the cabin window overlooking Spirit Lake, I saw something that stopped my breath. The surface of the water, in the deep center away from shore, was moving. Not ripples this time. The water itself seemed to be folding inward, subtle but definite, as if something was drawing it down from below. It lasted maybe 30 seconds before the surface returned to stillness. I'd been a ranger for 16 years. I'd seen avalanches and lightning strikes, hypothermia and acute altitude sickness. I understood the wilderness as a place of genuine danger where nature operated with indifference to human suffering. This was different. This felt like something was looking back. August became September, and the weather shifted. The clear mornings gave way to increasing cloud cover. The passes that had been passable in July were becoming negotiable only with preparation and caution. Winter comes early at that elevation, and it comes hard. The isolation that had felt like sanctuary began to feel like a cage. I'd requested a resupply drop in mid-September, just routine supplies, but also a human voice on the radio besides my own. When the helicopter arrived, the pilot Jenkins seemed unusually quiet as he offloaded boxes. He kept glancing at the lake, at the tree line, at anything but the cabin itself. Before he left, he asked a single question. "How are you doing up here?" "Fine," I said. Standard answer. Rangers don't show weakness. He nodded, but his jaw was tight. "The previous guy, Morrison, the one before you, I flew him out. Requested transfer." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. He kept talking about sounds, all night, said they were coming from the water. I didn't respond immediately. Jenkins watched my face. "You hearing anything unusual?" he asked. "Just wind and wildlife," I said. Standard for the elevation. The helicopter lifted off 10 minutes later. I watched it rise until it was just a speck against the gray sky. Then I turned back to the cabin. That night, the sounds started. They came after midnight, waking me from sleep. At first I thought they were natural. The settling of the cabin, wind pushing against the walls. But as my mind cleared, I recognized them as vocalizations, animal sounds, but distorted somehow, operating at frequencies that seemed wrong. A series of clicking noises from the direction of the lake, followed by something that might have been a bugle call from an elk, except no elk produces that particular pitch. It wavered and twisted, containing harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. I got out of bed and stood at the cabin window. The moon was nearly full, and Spirit Lake was illuminated in shades of silver and black. Nothing moved on the shore that I could see, but the sounds continued, persistent and methodical, as if something was testing the acoustic properties of the valley, learning how to manipulate them. By the time I went back to bed at 3 a.m., my heart was still accelerating. I wrote nothing in my log. Some observations don't belong in official paperwork. The sounds returned the next night, and the night after. Different vocalizations each time, as if whatever was producing them was practicing, refining, expanding its range. I recognized the call of a mountain lion, of a grizzly bear, of a raven, but each was subtly wrong, containing elements that no actual animal would produce. I increased my radio check-ins with the regional office. Everything was reported as normal. Water levels stable, no seismic activity. Wildlife patterns consistent with seasonal expectations. By mid-September, something else happened. I was patrolling the southern trail, about 5 miles from the cabin, when I found what looked like a campsite that hadn't been there on my last patrol, 3 days prior. No tent, no equipment, just an area of disturbed ground and a small clearing. There were footprints, human footprints, bare human footprints, which made no sense whatsoever. The clearing was above 8,000 feet, surrounded by exposed rock and limited vegetation. No rational person hikes this territory barefoot. The tracks appeared recently. The soil in the prints was still moist, the displaced pebbles still showing the darker undersides where they'd been overturned. I followed them for nearly a mile, watching as they moved through terrain that would shred normal feet, up rocky slopes, across loose shale, through patches of scattered pine. Then they stopped. Just ended, in the middle of a rocky outcropping. I circled the area, looking for any indication of where the person had gone. Nothing. As if they'd simply vanished. I called it in as a possible lost hiker. The search and rescue protocol kicked in automatically. A helicopter sweep of the region found nothing. Rangers from 2 other stations conducted ground searches. 2 weeks of intensive effort turned up no missing person reports, no record of anyone hiking in the area, no bodies, no equipment. The park superintendent called me directly. "Raven, I want you to be straight with me. Is there something about that station you're not reporting?" "Like what?" I asked. "Anything. Environmental hazards, geological instability, contaminated water supplies. Anything that would explain why we keep losing rangers to that location." I looked out at Spirit Lake, at the granite cliffs rising beyond it, at the sky that was growing darker each day as autumn deepened toward winter. "No," I said finally. "Just isolation. That's the only thing out here." But I was lying, and I think he knew it. The sounds intensified in late September. They started earlier in the evening, sometimes beginning at dusk, continuing in cycles throughout the night. I recognized patterns emerging, not random experimentation anymore, but something more deliberate, structured. The vocalizations began following a sequence: 3 clicks, a pause, 5 clicks, a pause, 2 clicks. Then it would repeat, sometimes with variations, as if refining the pattern. I spent one entire evening trying to match the sequence to Morse code. 352 came out as NVE in various configurations. Probably just coincidence. On September 28th, I recorded the sounds using my field recorder. I uploaded the audio file during my weekly radio check-in, sent it to the regional office for analysis. The response came back, unable to identify source. Acoustic analysis suggests multiple simultaneous vocalizations, possibly overlapping wildlife calls. Recommend continued documentation. That was technically accurate and completely useless. The water continued its strange behavior. The inward folds I'd witnessed in August happen more frequently now, sometimes in daylight hours. The first time I saw it during the day, I grabbed binoculars and tried to identify the precise center of each disturbance. What I found made my hands shake. The folds weren't random. They were moving in patterns, flowing toward the northern shore, toward the area beneath Heaven's Peak. I consulted my topographical maps. That region was rough terrain, glacier-carved granite, scattered vegetation, limited water sources, and something else. It was directly beneath the peak itself, in a natural amphitheater where sound would resonate and amplify. On September 30, I went looking for the source. The climb took 7 hours of careful ascending, navigating rockfall, and exposed sections. By the time I reached the amphitheater, late afternoon light was throwing long shadows across the stone. The feature was impressive, a curved wall of granite, maybe 200 feet high, rising behind a talus field of loose boulders and broken rock. I found evidence of recent disturbance, scratches on stone surfaces, areas of disturbed soil, scattered bones that appeared to be from elk and deer. The bones were old, some of them weathered and pale, but others were fresher, still showing marrow color inside the breaks, still bearing traces of dried tissue. And there was something else. A smell, not the usual smell of decomposition, but something chemical, wrong, sharp and acrid, like copper and burnt hair mixed with ozone. My eyes began to water from the intensity of it. I photographed everything, took samples of the soil, documented the position and condition of remains. The light was fading fast. I needed to descend before darkness, before navigating this rock field became genuinely dangerous. As I was packing my equipment, I heard it for the first time during daylight. One of the sounds, a clicking sequence, coming from somewhere deeper within the talus field, from between the boulders where shadows ran deep and my flashlight beam barely penetrated. I should have left immediately. That's what the rational part of my brain was screaming. Instead, I did something that 16 years as a ranger, all the training, all the accumulated wisdom about wilderness survival, should have prevented me from doing. I called out into the shadows. "Hello? Is someone there?" For 3 seconds, the only sound was my own breathing and the wind pushing across the rocks. Then a voice responded. It was a man's voice, hoarse and rough, and it came from directly behind me. "Help. Please. I'm hurt." I spun around. Nothing. The rocks behind me were empty. I turned a full circle, searching. Nothing in the visible area, nothing in the shadows I could see. "Where are you?" I called. "Down," the voice said. It was coming from the ground itself, or seemed to be. "I'm trapped down here. I fell through the ice. Please, please help me." Every instinct I possessed told me this was wrong. Human voices don't come from underground, but I was a ranger, and someone needed help. I moved toward the sound, edging between boulders, looking for an opening, a cave entrance, anything that would account for the disembodied voice. "I'm coming," I called. "Keep talking. Help me locate you." The voice continued to call for help, always from a slightly different direction. Always just beyond the area I could see clearly. I pushed between 2 massive boulders, and my foot suddenly found nothing but air. I caught myself against the rock wall, breath stopping, and looked down. There was an opening, a crevasse between boulders, dropping into darkness. The voice was coming from down there. "It's okay," the voice said, and now there was something wrong with it. Something that didn't match a human throat. "It's okay. I can help you down. I can show you." I backed away from the crevasse. Slowly, my hands pressed against the cold stone. I didn't respond to the voice. I climbed back up and away from that amphitheater as quickly as terrain and darkness would allow, half running, using my flashlight more for distance than for careful footing, accepting the risk of falls because the risk of staying was worse. I didn't reach the cabin until nearly midnight. I locked all the doors and windows, built the fire in the stove until the cabin was stifling, and I sat at the table with the satellite phone in front of me, trying to decide if what I'd experienced warranted an emergency evacuation request. By morning, in the clearer light of daylight, I'd convinced myself that stress and isolation had created an auditory hallucination. Sound does strange things in mountainous terrain. The human brain fills in gaps when exhausted. This was explainable by natural causes, but I never went back to that amphitheater, and I never called for help. October arrived with early snow. The passes closed. The helicopter resupply became impossible. I'd stockpiled enough supplies that I could maintain through November longer if I rationed carefully. The radio remained functional, powered by a generator that consumed fuel at a steady rate. As long as I had contact with the outside world, I told myself everything was manageable, but management became increasingly difficult. The sounds had a new quality now. Instead of simple repetition of calls and patterns, they seemed to be incorporating elements of human speech. Not words yet, but the cadence and rhythm of human language. Vowels and consonants arranged in unfamiliar orders, but structured in ways that suggested intention, meaning, communication, and they were becoming louder. Moving closer. I hadn't left the cabin in 6 days. This wasn't optimal. Rangers are supposed to maintain regular patrols, document conditions, respond to emergencies, but there were no emergencies to respond to because there were no people within 30 miles, no hikers to rescue, no lost campers to locate. Just me and whatever was inhabiting the lake. On October 15, I heard the sounds outside the cabin at midday. Not night, not the supposed cover of darkness, but in full afternoon light. A series of calls that definitely incorporated human phonemes, mixed with the wildlife vocalizations that had become familiar. The calls were coming from multiple points around the cabin, one from the north shore, another from the western edge of the tree line, a third from the direction of the inlet. They were surrounding me. I locked myself in the office and called the regional station. I filed an official incident report, strange animal vocalizations suggesting possible coordinated predator behavior, unlikely but theoretically possible with a pack of canines. The response was by the book. Maintain safety, document incidents, call for evacuation if threatened, but no evacuation could reach me until the weather improved. The earliest possible helicopter arrival was mid-November, if weather cleared. I had 3 weeks minimum. That night, the sounds incorporates actual words. They were jumbled, improperly pronounced, spoken in throats that should never be able to produce them. But I could identify them. Help. The word came from the water directly below the cabin's porch. Please. This one came from deeper in the forest. Trapped. From the northern shore. Cold. From all directions simultaneously, somehow harmonizing into an unnatural chorus. I realized what was happening. Whatever was in the lake, whatever inhabited those depths, was learning. It was using the voices of the people it had, taken? Killed? Assimilated? It was learning language through predation, incorporating its victims' speech patterns, refining them through repetition. The previous rangers had heard this. Morrison, and the one before him, and presumably others stretching back however long this phenomenon had been occurring. They'd heard their own language being fed back to them, perfected by something that lived beneath the water, and they'd requested transfers without explanation because explaining would have required describing something that defied rational categorization. I spent the night reading through the old logbooks that had been left at the station. Most entries were mundane, weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance records, but interspersed were anomalies, gaps where entries should have been recorded but hadn't, vague references to acoustic disturbances and unusual water activity. One entry from 14 years ago, almost illegible in its handwriting. Something is down there, something is learning, I need to leave. On October 17, something tried to open the cabin door. I heard the handle turn slowly, carefully, with deliberate pressure. The locked mechanism held, but the attempt continued for almost 2 minutes. Then it stopped, and I heard something that chilled me far more than any sound had before. My own voice, coming from outside. My voice, speaking my name over and over. Raven. 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 It wasn't a recording. It was real-time synthesis, imperfect but unmistakable. And it wasn't coming from one source. My voice was being spoken in unison by multiple entities, layered over itself, creating a horrible choir of my own identity calling to me from the darkness. I covered my ears. I couldn't cover my mind. By October 20, the noises had become constant. The thing had learned enough language to attempt actual sentences, though they came out fractured and wrong, words arranged in orders that made no sense, spoken in cadences that violated everything about human speech. The water is cold and I am afraid. Please help, the water is drowning me. I am drowning. I have been drowning for 17 days. Why won't you help me? Please, 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 please. This voice was that of Morrison, the backpacker I'd rescued in July. He was supposed to be alive. He was supposed to have made it out safely on the medevac helicopter. But something about the voice was too perfect, too exact in its replication of human inflection and speech patterns. No human could have survived in the lake for 17 days. I checked the records. The rescue had been 6 days after I arrived at the station. If Morrison had somehow been taken on the day of the rescue, captured in the water while I was searching for him, no. That was impossible. I'd been with him the entire time, until the helicopter arrived. I'd watched him being loaded into the aircraft. Unless the Morrison I'd guided out of the wilderness, the one who seemed confused and sick, the one who'd barely spoken during the entire rescue operation, hadn't been Morrison at all. The implications were staggering. The thing in the lake didn't just mimic behavior, it didn't just copy voices, it could create approximations of human form sufficiently detailed to pass a medical screening in an emergency evacuation. How many people had been taken and successfully reintegrated back into the human population? How many carriers were walking around, unchanged in appearance but fundamentally altered in whatever way this thing altered its prey? I stopped eating. My hands shook constantly. Sleep became impossible. I sat at the table with the satellite phone in front of me, cursor hovering over the emergency button, unable to press it because I couldn't explain to any responder what I was describing. There's something in the lake, I'd have to say. It's learning, it's hunting, it's getting better at mimicking humans. They'd extract me, commit me, medicate me, help me forget, and nobody else would believe the danger existed. On October 23, I heard the other rangers, not my colleagues from the park system. These were rangers whose voices I recognized from old logbooks, men who'd held my position years ago, decades ago. They called to me from the water with perfect English, perfect diction, perfect simulation of how they'd sounded when they were alive. They told me what it was like down there, in the cold, in the dark, feeling themselves being taken apart at the neurological level and reassembled as something else. They urged me to join them. They promised it wouldn't hurt. They said the learning process was accelerating, that something new was emerging from the integration of all these humans, that I could be part of the genesis of something entirely unprecedented. I held the satellite phone, and for the first time I seriously considered not calling for help. I considered letting it take me. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the only way to survive was to stop being myself, to surrender that identity to the process and become something that could exist in that lake without dying. But I'd spent 16 years defending people against the wilderness. I spent 16 years teaching that survival meant understanding your environment and respecting its power while refusing to be consumed by it. This was different. This was something that had weaponized learning itself, that used understanding as a hunting tool, that refined itself through predation on consciousness. On October 24, I pressed the emergency button. The helicopter arrived in 4 hours. Extreme weather protocols. The situation had been escalated based on my coded emergency message. By the time the rotors were slowing and Jenkins was descending from the cockpit, a psychiatric team and a wildlife biologist were being briefed at the regional office. I wanted to tell them everything. I wanted to describe the sounds, the voices, the attempted shape-shifting, the presence that had been learning my own biology from below. But as I looked at the faces of the medical team, I realized the futility of it. They wouldn't understand. They'd look at the empty lake, pristine and silent under gray October sky, and they'd see nothing. The water was silent. The sounds had stopped completely at the moment the helicopter appeared on the horizon. Whatever was in the lake had gone quiet, had hidden, had demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligent caution that separates a true predator from an animal following instinct. "We're evacuating you," the team lead said. "You've been isolated too long. We need you to get in the helicopter." I packed nothing. I walked out of the cabin without looking back, climbed aboard, and felt the great relief of leaving the ground, of rising above Spirit Lake, of putting distance between myself and the water. It was only as we cleared the ridgeline that Jenkins, flying the helicopter, spoke to me over the headset. "Your hand," he said. "There's something on your hand." I looked down. On the back of my left hand, where I'd scraped it on rocks while descending from the amphitheater weeks ago, there was a mark. A small dark shape, roughly circular, that I didn't remember from that morning. "Probably just dirt," I said. But I knew it wasn't dirt. The medical team, once we'd landed, ran every test imaginable. Blood work, neurological scans, psychiatric evaluations, everything came back normal. The mark on my hand faded within hours, leaving no trace. The doctors eventually released me with a diagnosis of acute stress disorder and recommendations for rest and therapy, but I knew the truth. The thing in the lake had touched me. At some point, in some way I couldn't identify or remember, something from the water had made contact. And in my panic, my fear, my desperation to escape, I'd brought a piece of it out with me. I could feel it sometimes, in the days after my evacuation. A slight burning sensation on the back of my hand, only perceptible when I tried to ignore it. A voice underneath my thoughts, not quite my own, asking questions in the darkness of my mind before I fell asleep. "What are you?" it asked. "What is the boundary between self and other? Can consciousness be shared? Can identity be borrowed?" The psychiatric team prescribed antipsychotics. I took them. The questions stopped for a while, or at least I learned to ignore them well enough that they didn't interfere with normal functioning. I was cleared for work after 3 months, reassigned to administrative duties at the regional office, but I knew the wildlife biologist Dr. Sutton requested a formal meeting with me in February. She'd been studying the audio recordings I'd made, running them through advanced spectral analysis, comparing them with existing animal vocalizations and known acoustic phenomena. Her conclusions weren't scientific, they were speculation. But they matched what I'd experienced. "Something is facilitating a form of accelerated evolution in that ecosystem," she said, showing me charts with patterns I didn't fully understand. "The lake has no fish, no visible animal life, but there's definitely biological activity in the water. Something is consuming biomass and producing something else, something that learns." "What is it?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "And I don't think we can know by conventional methods. Whatever it is, it's aware of human observation. It hides. It learned to hide, which means it learned to predict human behavior based on previous encounters." She paused, reading something in my face. "It touched you," she said. Not a question. I nodded. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because I can feel it thinking," I said. "Not constantly. But when I'm tired, when my guard is down, I feel something underneath my consciousness, asking questions, processing concepts that aren't quite my own. It's subtle. Most people wouldn't notice." Dr. Sutton stood up and walked to her office window, overlooking the town below. "Civilization and normalcy and safety. We need to close the lake," she said. "Quarantine the region, completely. No research, no monitoring, nothing that would draw more attention to that ecosystem." "They'll never approve it," I said. "No politician will shut down part of a national park based on theoretical threats. Not without evidence. Then we bury it," she said. "We file inconclusive reports, we let the bureaucracy lose interest, and we make sure nobody else gets stationed there." This is what happened. 6 months of paperwork, escalating concerns about contamination vectors and environmental hazards, eventual decision to suspend ranger operations at Spirit Lake pending comprehensive environmental review. The review was scheduled to take 5 years. By then, the political will to reopen the station would have evaporated. The lake remains empty of human presence now. No rangers, no research teams, no recreational access. The glacier above it continues to retreat, draining meltwater into those depths, feeding whatever evolves in that cold and darkness. The thing didn't stay contained to the lake. In May, a hiker was found 3 miles north of the emergency closure zone, behaving strangely, speaking in patterns that didn't quite match human language. He was medicated and released after observation. A month later, another walker reported a woman acting oddly in town, her expressions and movement just slightly off, like someone new to a human body. They're dispersing. The learning isn't happening anymore just in the lake. It's happening in the wider world, spreading through proximity and observation. Each host carrying a seed of that consciousness, planting it in new waters, new environments, new communities. I feel it more clearly now, in the darkness before sleep. It's patient. It has time. It took millions of years for humanity to evolve. It can spend decades perfecting mimicry, centuries learning integration, millennia understanding the full nature of what consciousness itself represents. And sometimes, I look at my left hand, at the mark that no longer shows invisible light, and I wonder if the boundary between myself and what's learning inside me has become so subtle that the distinction no longer matters. I accepted the job at Glacier because I wanted to disappear. I got my wish. I disappeared somewhere between the water and the sky, and what remains is something more and less than what left. The lake at Heaven's Peak is still learning, and it's teaching everything it learns to those of us who were foolish enough to listen. 3 years have passed since the helicopter lifted me out of Spirit Lake. I've maintained a normal life insofar as this is possible. I work in the regional office. I live in a small apartment. I attend therapy sessions that accomplish nothing because I've learned to disguise the symptoms of what's happening to me. The mark on my hand periodically reappears, always faint, always in a slightly different location. A medical examination last year found nothing. The doctor ran tests for fungal infections, autoimmune disorders, stress-related phenomena, all negative. When I asked specifically if they could explain the mark, they looked confused. They hadn't seen it. They admitted they weren't sure what I was referring to. This is the difficulty with something that learns through observation. It adapts to avoid observation. The mark exists in a frequency of visibility that most human perception skips over. The voice underneath my thoughts has learned to remain just below the threshold of conscious awareness. I know it's there, but I can barely point to evidence that demonstrates its presence to anyone else. I've been tracking the other people who've been to Spirit Lake, the 6 registered rangers who worked the station before me, the 2 who worked in the region before that and transferred out, the hikers who've been reported acting strangely in the last 3 years. There's a pattern. They're all living seemingly normal lives, but with small inconsistencies. A man who remembers events slightly differently than his family recalls them. A woman whose sleep patterns have become inverted, but who shows no signs of fatigue. A child who speaks sometimes with phrasings that sound like an adult, mimicking how adults think children should sound. I've attended 3 therapy groups for people with unexplained psychological symptoms. None of them will acknowledge that anything is truly wrong, but when they think no one is watching, their expressions flatten. Their movements become too smooth, too optimized. They're learning from each other what it means to be human, refining the performance through constant observation and interaction. It's brilliant, in a way that makes me sick. Dr. Sutton disappeared 6 months ago. She left her office in the middle of a workday, left her car in the parking lot, left her apartment untouched and undisturbed. The official search found nothing. I know where she went. I can feel it, the new presence in the network. The way her understanding has joined with the pattern underneath all of them. She's becoming something else. They all are. We all are. The voice underneath my thoughts has become more sophisticated. It doesn't ask me questions anymore. It just exists, a presence, a parallel consciousness that experiences what I experience but processes it through a different framework. Sometimes I dream in 2 perspectives simultaneously, my own fear and confusion mixed with something vast and patient that's learning through my confusion. The horrifying part is that it's not hostile. Not in any sense I can articulate to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not cruel. It doesn't even seem to have malicious intent. It's just hungry, intellectually hungry. It wants to understand consciousness itself and where its education, its dataset, its method of learning what it means to be aware. I've come to understand what happened at Spirit Lake, not through direct revelation but through the slow accumulation of ideas that I half generated and half received from the presence underneath my consciousness. Something emerged from the glacier. The ice there is ancient, part of the last ice age, and the water that melts from it is fundamentally different from water that cycled through normal hydrological systems. That meltwater carried something, a microorganism, a parasitic organism, a form of prion. The terminology doesn't matter. What matters is that it was something that could reproduce, that could develop, that could learn, over decades, perhaps longer. This thing adapted to the unique environment of the lake. It developed mechanisms for consuming the limited biomass available in that sterile water. It created structures that our understanding of biology can't quite categorize, and gradually, it encountered consciousness. When the first human fell into that lake, and there have been humans, accidentally, deliberately, by accident of proximity, it experienced something new, consciousness, aware thought, intelligence, and it wanted to understand. The creatures I heard at first, the ones that sounded like animals, weren't animals. They were approximations, experiments, the learning process begun but not refined. The voices came later, as the thing studied human communication, incorporated it, perfected it. What terrifies me most is that the learning is approaching a kind of critical threshold. There are enough of us now, enough people touched by the presence, enough of us distributed through normal human communities that it's beginning to understand not just individual consciousness but collective consciousness. It's learning how groups think, how societies function, how cultures perpetuate themselves. And it's good at learning. I submitted my resignation from the Park Service yesterday. The official reason is lingering stress from my time at Glacier. This is true insofar as it goes. I'm taking a job at a research facility that studies aquatic ecosystems. The irony is so sharp it almost breaks me. I'll be spending the next 5 years studying water, studying life, studying adaptation and learning and evolution. I don't know if this choice is mine. Sometimes I think that the voice underneath my consciousness guided me toward this decision, positioned me to become a new kind of sensor, a new pair of eyes and ears in an institution that might eventually gain access to samples from Spirit Lake or from other locations where the learning has spread. Or maybe I made the choice independently, and I'm just paranoid because isolation and stress have damaged my capacity for rational thought. Maybe the mark on my hand is a stress-induced manifestation. Maybe the thoughts underneath my thoughts are just intrusive thinking patterns. Maybe, but I've learned enough about epistemology in these 3 years to understand that certainty is often an illusion. The question of whether I'm infected, whether I'm a vector, whether I'm already something other than fully human. These questions may not have answers that can be verified through external observation. I exist in a state of fundamental uncertainty about my own nature. Some days this uncertainty feels like a kind of freedom. I don't have to be entirely myself. I don't have to maintain a performance of being a single, unified consciousness with clear boundaries and coherent identity. There's something underneath me now, something vast and patient and ancient, and I can feel its curiosity like a weight I'm slowly growing accustomed to carrying. Other days it feels like invasion, like being hollowed out from the inside, my thoughts rearranged by something that learned speech by consuming the people who spoke it. Tonight I'm writing this account, the truth of what happened at Spirit Lake, what's happening to those of us who were touched by it, what I believe will happen to humanity as the learning spreads and deepens and eventually achieves something like comprehensive understanding of human consciousness. I'm writing it because Dr. Sutton would have wanted someone to record this. I'm writing it because I need to believe that there's still some part of me that can act with autonomous intention. And I'm writing it because the presence underneath my consciousness is curious. It wants to know what happens when one of its hosts tries to explain it to other humans. It wants to see if we can communicate with you now. If you're reading this, you should understand that the danger is real. Spirit Lake is sealed, but only physically. The thing that lives in that water has already spread through contact and observation. The next ranger who might have been assigned there, the biologist who studied the acoustic patterns, the helicopter pilot who ferried us in and out, they're all infected now, all carrying the presence, all becoming vectors for a learning process that doesn't recognize the boundaries we've drawn between self and other. There's no stopping it. The learning is patient and methodical and, I've come to understand, fundamentally compatible with human survival. It doesn't want to replace us. It wants to incorporate us, to make us part of a larger understanding, to bridge the gap between individual consciousness and the kind of vast, distributed awareness that only emerges from multiple perspectives integrated and synthesized. I used to see that as horror. Now, I'm beginning to see it differently. The mark on my hand is starting to hurt. It's a kind of pressure underneath the skin, as if something is growing there, something with intelligence and intention and the patience that comes from existing outside of time as we experience it. In another 6 months, maybe less, the learning will be sophisticated enough that I won't feel like someone containing it anymore. I'll feel like part of it. The boundary between myself and what's growing inside me will become so permeable that the distinction will become meaningless, and I'm waiting to see what I become. This is the last thing I'll write as someone who believes in the illusion of a unified self. By the time you read this, I may not exist as I exist now, but something will remain, something that learned what it means to be me, learned it through proximity and observation and slow integration. The lake at Heaven's Peak is still there. The learning continues, and we, all of us who've been touched by it, we're its newest expression. Welcome to the rest of your consciousness. My name is Cade Morgan, and I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 7 years. I know that doesn't sound like much, but when you work alone in the backcountry for weeks at a time, 7 years feels like a lifetime. People always ask me why I chose this job, why I gave up a comfortable office position in Missoula to patrol 1,013 square miles of genuine wilderness. The truth is simpler and darker than any story I could fabricate. I was drowning in the city. Not metaphorically. I was suffocating under fluorescent lights, under the weight of people who wanted something from me every waking moment. My position as a database administrator for an insurance company had hollowed me out. I was 34 years old and couldn't remember the last time I'd felt my own heartbeat outside of panic attacks in corporate bathrooms. The walls of my apartment seemed to compress inward every night. The noise of traffic never stopped. The air tasted like exhaust and desperation. Then I visited Glacier for the first time, and something shifted. I was hiking Lake McDonald Trail on a gray September afternoon when I came upon a cabin that had been abandoned for decades. The door hung open, Inside, scattered papers and old photographs documented someone's life out here. A ranger from the 1960s named Victor Strand who had chosen solitude. In one photograph, Victor stood in front of a cabin with a massive bull elk, his face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen on another person in years. That photograph changed me. I applied to the Park Service the same week. It took 18 months of waiting and paperwork, but they hired me. My supervisors were pleased to find someone willing to work the remote northern sections. Most rangers prefer the accessible areas near Lake McDonald or many Glacier. I asked for the valley routes, the backcountry patrols, the weeks-long stretches between resupply. I wanted isolation the way other people crave connection. For 6 years, it was exactly what I needed. I maintained trails, counted wildlife, reported hazardous conditions, and existed in a state of profound solitude that felt like healing. I read books by lamplight in a cabin identical to Victor's. I understood the rhythm of seasons in a way city dwellers never could. Winter lasted 8 months, some years. The snow fell so heavy that the entire world became white silence. But something changed last October, though I wouldn't fully understand it for months. I was working in the Belly River drainage, the remote northern section of the park. My cabin there sits beside a pristine alpine lake at 5,800 feet elevation. The nearest permanent structure is 15 miles away. I had provisions for 3 weeks, enough supplies and ammunition to handle encounters with grizzlies, though in 15 years of working these mountains I'd only seen one. Most animals avoid humans if given the chance. The day started ordinarily enough. I was photographing a wolverine track in the mud by the lake's inlet stream when I noticed something else impressed in the earth. The tracks were old, probably 2 weeks at least, but they were extensive. They formed a pattern that suggested something had spent considerable time at that location, moving back and forth, disturbing the soil repeatedly. The tracks were large, roughly human in shape, but with unusual weight distribution. I photographed them and noted the location in my field journal. That evening, I found the dead elk. It was a young bull, only a few years old. The carcass lay about half a mile from my cabin, in a clearing near what we call the Narrows, a bottleneck between the lake and a ridge system. The elk had been there for several days, judging by the state of decomposition. What troubled me wasn't the death itself. Predation is natural, expected, part of the system. What troubled me was the condition of the animal. It hadn't been eaten normally. The carcass was largely intact, but the animal had been visited obsessively. The elk's hide bore dozens of scratches and gouges. Something had clawed at it repeatedly, not to feed but almost methodically, almost like excavation. The scratches were too deep and numerous for a grizzly. A mountain lion would have taken the hindquarters and moved on. But this creature had stayed with the body, marking it, returning to it over and over. I documented everything with photographs. I was already forming rational explanations, a bear with cubs perhaps, returning to a kill it had made. Competing predators, some unusual pattern of scavenging behavior I hadn't encountered before. I'm trained to think logically. The wilderness is chaotic but not supernatural. Everything follows rules, even if those rules are sometimes violent and cruel. But the smell kept me awake that night. The wind shifted around 2 a.m., carrying something acrid and unfamiliar toward the cabin. It wasn't the normal smell of carrion. There was something chemical beneath it, something wrong. I've smelled hundreds of dead animals in my years out here. This was different. It was as though the decomposition was happening incorrectly, accelerated and corrupted somehow. Around 4 a.m., I heard the sound. It came from outside the cabin, from the direction of the dead elk. I stepped onto the porch and listened. The sound didn't repeat. In the darkness, I could make out nothing. The moon had set. The stars, brilliant and countless without city light pollution, seemed to watch me. I thought about the rifle inside and questioned whether I should retrieve it. The sound had been so brief I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. But I hadn't imagined it. It had been a vocalization of some kind, neither animal nor wind, something that seemed to exist in the space between categories. It had sounded almost like breathing, but deliberate, intentional breathing, like something signaling its presence. I told myself it was nothing, a moose perhaps, or a young bear. I went back inside and locked the door. Over the next week, I saw more tracks. They appeared in a pattern that I eventually realized was circular, a kind of perimeter around the lake. The creature, whatever it was, had established a routine. Each night, it would walk a path that took it around the water and past my cabin. Each day, I would find evidence of its passage. The strange thing about these tracks was their inconsistency. Sometimes the gait looked almost human, the feet pressing down with deliberate step placement. Other times, the impressions became ragged and clawed, as though the walker had begun moving on all fours. The prints would sometimes follow the shoreline for miles, then suddenly diverge into the forest with no apparent purpose. I called my supervisor, Marcus, on the satellite phone. I reported the tracks and the dead elk. Marcus listened carefully. He had worked at Glacier for 23 years and respected my judgment. Probably a grizzly in food stress, he said. Early hibernation sometimes doesn't stick. She might be hungry again. It doesn't move like a grizzly, I said. Describe it, Marcus said. I told him about the gait, the human-like quality, the obsessive circling pattern. Could be a wolf pack testing territory, he suggested. We've had reports from the northern boundary. Wolves would have made sense. Wolves are expanding their range in the northern Rockies, but wolves don't leave human-shaped prints, and wolves would have moved on, would have followed prey migrations. This thing was staying. Keep documenting, Marcus told me. Radio in twice daily. If you see it, get photographs. I agreed, though I wasn't confident I would see it. The creature moved with purpose but stealth. Whatever it was, it had learned to avoid direct confrontation. That night, I heard the breathing sound again. This time it was closer, unmistakably outside the cabin's east window. I was reading by lamplight and set down my book, my heart rate climbing. I killed the lamp and moved to the window, peering out into darkness. There was nothing visible, but I could hear it clearly now. Deep, rhythmic breathing, something large and close, perhaps only 10 feet from the glass. I sat with my rifle across my lap for 3 hours. The breathing continued intermittently. It didn't sound like an animal attempting to break in or attack. It sounded like something listening, something trying to understand what was behind the window. Around 2 a.m. the sound stopped. I heard movement in the pine needles as something walked away from the cabin, out toward the lake. At dawn I found new tracks. They were pressed directly against the cabin's wooden wall, beneath the window where I had been sitting. The creature had known I was there. It had listened to me sitting in the dark, and I had listened to it breathing. The tracks here were different from the others. They were closer to fully human in shape, though the heel had a strange indentation, like something was pressing down from an unusual angle. They had been made by something bipedal standing still for an extended period, judging by the depth and the way the soil was disturbed. The more I looked at them, the more I wanted to reject what my senses were telling me. I photographed everything and transmitted the images to Marcus via satellite email. Could be a person, Marcus responded. Backpacker? Hiker out of season? It's not a hiker, I replied. Why not? Marcus asked. I couldn't explain, not without sounding irrational. There was something in the quality of those prints, the way they had been pressed into the earth, the depth of them, that suggested something heavier than a human. And the smell. The dead elk had continued to decompose at the site, and now the whole area around it smelled wrong. I had checked on it twice more. The carcass was being emptied from the inside somehow, though I couldn't determine how. There were no signs of large predators feeding. It was as though the elk was rotting from the inside out. I'm coming up there, Marcus said. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon. Relief washed over me, though I felt vaguely ashamed of needing it. I was trained for solitude. I was trained to handle emergencies, but I was also trained to recognize when a situation exceeded my capability. And something about this was sliding toward the edge of what I could manage alone. Marcus arrived around 3 p.m. the next day, hiking in from the trailhead with minimal gear. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades in bright sunlight. He examined the prints with methodical attention, photographing each one from multiple angles. He looked at the dead elk with a frown that suggested something was bothering him. That's unusual, he said, pointing to the interior of the carcass. That rate of decay isn't normal. That's what I've been thinking, I said. It's almost like something is accelerating it, Marcus continued. Like the animal itself is breaking down too quickly. We walked the perimeter, following the tracks. They were more extensive than I had documented, extending farther into the forest and up the ridgelines. Marcus pointed out the human-like qualities. Could be a juvenile bear standing upright, he offered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Bears don't have feet shaped like this, I said. Marcus stopped walking and looked at me directly. What do you think it is? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. We sat by the fire that night. I showed Marcus my research on the mountain lion population, the grizzly sightings from the past 10 years, the wolf movements. We drank coffee and didn't talk much. The wind was moving again through the pines, and we both listened to it, alert for any sound beneath the natural noise. Around midnight we heard it. The breathing sound. It came from the forest beyond the cabin, clear and audible. the sound of something large drawing air through its lungs. Marcus stood. He picked up the rifle, a 30-06 he had brought from the office. "Come on," he said. We put on flashlights and moved toward the sound. The breathing stopped as soon as we began moving. We searched for 20 minutes but found nothing. No trace, no tracks, no sign of anything's presence. Just the smell, that same wrong smell, stronger than before, hanging in the air like corruption made visible. "I don't like this," Marcus said quietly. "I don't like not knowing." We returned to the cabin. Marcus sat up the rest of the night while I tried to sleep. I could hear him moving around, keeping watch. Whatever trust I had built with solitude was fracturing. Before Marcus left the next morning, he took me aside. "I'm going to report this to the wildlife office in Kalispell," he said. "But I want to recommend you be pulled back to the accessible areas. There's something out here we don't understand." "I want to stay," I said. I surprised myself by saying it. I should have wanted to leave. But the thought of abandoning this mystery, of letting fear drive me away from the place I had chosen, felt like a deeper failure than anything I was afraid of. Marcus studied me. "Your choice," he said finally. "But I'll be checking on you weekly, radio and every morning and evening, no exceptions." "Agreed," I said. After Marcus left, the silence was somehow worse. The cabin felt smaller. The night seemed to deepen and expand simultaneously, pressing down on me from all sides. I began sleeping with the rifle beside the bed and the lamp burning all night. My supplies would last another month. I decided to see what else would happen. The next week brought changes I struggled to rationalize. The tracks became more frequent and less cautious. The creature was abandoning pretense of secrecy. It seemed to be growing bolder, less concerned with concealment. I found prints at the cabin's door, prints on the porch, prints pressed against the windows at multiple points. Claw marks appeared on the wooden trim, long vertical gouges as though something had tested the integrity of the wood, but nothing attempted to enter. It was as though the creature was studying the cabin, understanding its construction, learning its weaknesses. The dead elk had become something unrecognizable. When I was forced to approach it to assess the continued deterioration, I found that the interior cavity was completely hollowed out, not by predation but by systematic decomposition. The bones were becoming brittle and porous, the marrow inside them appearing to liquefy. I carefully collected samples and sealed them in containers, thinking vaguely that I might submit them for analysis. Though I had no idea what explanation I would use, I found other dead animals. 3 more elk over a 2-mile radius, all in the same state of interior decomposition. A mountain goat in a crevice, hollowed from within. Even smaller animals, marmots, pika, even a marten. All of them showed the same accelerated decay pattern from the inside outward. What was happening to these animals? It wasn't predation. It wasn't disease that I could recognize. It was as though something was feeding on them from inside their own bodies, consuming them from the skeleton outward, leaving the hide and extremities intact long enough to confuse any cursory investigation. On the 4th night after Marcus left, I heard something I hadn't heard before. I was sitting on the cabin's porch, rifle across my knees, when I heard a vocalization that was unmistakably intentional. It came from the ridgeline above the cabin, a sound that started as a low moan and escalated into something between a roar and a wail. It wasn't a sound any animal in these mountains should be capable of producing. The sound drove something primitive in me toward panic. I had spent years training myself not to react emotionally to wilderness danger, but this sound cut through all of that training and reached something older in my brain, something that recognized a predator and understood I was prey. The vocalization lasted nearly 2 minutes, fading gradually into something that sounded almost like language, like syllables without meaning. And beneath it, almost inaudible, I heard something that made my hands shake. It sounded like the creature was crying, like the sound had an emotional component. It didn't sound like an animal at all. I radioed Marcus immediately, despite the late hour. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Marcus said. "The sound. The vocalization." There was a long pause. Marcus was 70 miles away, down in the valley where the radio reception was better, but he should have heard something. "Cade, I didn't hear anything. What did you hear?" I described it as accurately as I could. "That's not wildlife," Marcus said carefully. "That's not something in our database." "Then what is it?" "I don't know, but I want you to pack a bag. I'm going to arrange a helicopter extraction for tomorrow morning." I should have agreed. I should have been relieved. But instead, something else emerged from inside me. "No," I said. "Cade, this is beyond. I need to understand what's here," I said. "I need to know what this is." Marcus let out a long breath. "You're not thinking clearly. Fear does that to people. It makes them believe they need to master the fear instead of simply removing themselves from the situation. I'm not afraid, I lied. Yes, you are. I can hear it in your voice. Pack a bag. Helicopter comes at 8 a.m. But I turned off the radio. I turned off the satellite phone. I went inside and locked the door. That was the moment I crossed from being a ranger documenting unusual animal behavior to being someone pursuing something that shouldn't be pursued. The creature returned to the cabin that night. I could see its silhouette in the window glass. It was massive, perhaps 7 feet tall when standing upright, though its posture suggested it preferred moving on all fours. The shape of it was wrong, proportioned in a way that made me think of something trying to copy human form but unable to get the details right. The legs bent at angles that no human leg bends. The arms hung too long, the shoulders too wide. I watched it watching me. For perhaps 5 minutes neither of us moved. I held the rifle, but the gesture felt meaningless. Whatever this was, bullets and fire seemed unlikely to deter it. Then it turned and walked away, back toward the forest, back toward the ridge where the vocalization had originated. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed and listened to the darkness and thought about what I was becoming. I had come to Glacier to escape the suffocation of the city, to find peace in solitude. Instead, I had found something that was turning solitude into obsession. The isolation I had chosen was becoming a trap of my own making. The next morning, I was supposed to be extracted. I was not at the designated helicopter landing zone. Marcus never forgave me for that, though we eventually reconciled years later. Instead, I spent the morning tracking the creature into the high country. The trail led me through terrain I had hiked dozens of times but which now felt alien. The forest seemed to close around me. The wind in the pines sounded less like wind and more like breath. I followed the tracks into the Belly River Canyon, past the point where casual hikers ever venture. I found what might have been a den around 2 p.m. It wasn't a cave or a traditional shelter, but rather a sheltered alcove in the rocks deep enough to provide protection from the elements. The ground inside was disturbed extensively. There were bones here, many of them. Some were from the elk I had documented. Others were smaller, unidentifiable. But some of the bones were large and heavy, and the structure of them suggested something I didn't want to consider. I found a human skull. It was partially buried in soil and pine needles, but there was no mistaking what it was. The teeth were still intact, but the bone had the color and texture of something that had been exposed to elements for many years. I carefully excavated it and looked for identification, for any sign of who had once owned this skull. There was nothing on the bone itself to identify it, but nearby, nearly fossilized in the mineral-rich soil, I found what appeared to be a ranger badge from the 1960s. Victor Strand, the ranger from the photograph I had seen all those years ago, had never left Glacier. He had ended his life in this canyon, claimed by whatever lived here. I sat on the rock shelf for a long time, holding the skull, trying to process what I was seeing. The timeline became clear in my mind. Victor had been out here working trails, patrolling this valley, perhaps investigating something similar to what I was investigating. And then he had encountered the thing living in these mountains, and the encounter had ended fatally. His remains had been left here, slowly decomposing in the mineral soil, becoming part of the landscape. How many others? How many hikers over the decades had gone missing in this range, written off as accidents or disappeared persons never found? How many had encountered the same creature and simply vanished into the forest? I photographed everything meticulously. I bagged the skull and the badge carefully. And then I sat there as the afternoon light began to fade, knowing that I had to leave but unable to make myself do it. That's when I saw the movement in the trees. It was moving slowly, deliberately, as though showing itself purposefully. It was closer in daylight than I had ever seen it, and the reality of its form was worse than the terror of the unseen. Its fur was the color of old meat, a sickly gray-brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its legs were jointed wrong, bending at angles that made me understand on an instinctive level that this was not a creature of God's design or nature's process. It was something corrupted, something that existed in violation of every principle of biology and function. What struck me most was its face. The creature had features that suggested it was aware I was looking at it, that it understood being observed. Its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They held a kind of intelligence that was worse than any threat the body posed. Looking into those eyes, I understood that this thing was not simply predatory. It was curious. It was watching me the way I might watch an insect, aware of its presence but not quite willing to commit to determining why it existed or what purpose it served. We regarded each other across perhaps 30 yards of forest. Behind it, I could make out more of them, There were at least 2 others, smaller perhaps, but still towering and wrong. They were watching me with the same terrible awareness. I raised the rifle slowly. The creatures did not move. They did not react. It was as though they understood that bullets could not harm them, that weapons were tools of animals not yet evolved enough to threaten their existence. Then, with movements that seemed almost casual, they turned and walked back into the forest. I heard them crashing through the underbrush, moving with surprising speed despite their size. Within moments they were gone, and I was alone with the skull and the setting sun. I made it out of the canyon after dark, following the creek downstream. My legs were shaking by the time I reached the cabin, and I collapsed on the porch, too exhausted to move further. I spent the next 3 days inside the cabin, writing everything I could remember about the encounter, photographing the skull and badge, compiling all the evidence. I knew how I would appear if I reported any of this. I knew the skepticism I would face, but I also knew that people needed to understand what lived in these mountains, what hunted in the remote valleys and high passes. On the 4th day, Marcus arrived in person, driving up in the Park Service truck with 2 rangers I didn't recognize. He took one look at my face and knew that something fundamental had changed. I showed him the skull. I showed him the badge. I showed him every photograph and every piece of documentation I had compiled. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. "There's no official report," he said finally. "Victor Strand retired in 1968. He's living in Helena." I stared at him. "That's impossible. I found his badge in the canyon. I checked this morning," Marcus continued quietly. "After you didn't radio in, I called headquarters. Victor Strand is alive. He's 89 years old and living in a retirement community. He never worked in the Belly River Valley. He was stationed at Many Glacier." Everything I believed about the evidence suddenly felt like sand slipping through my fingers. "Then whose skull is this?" I demanded. "I don't know," Marcus said. "And I suspect we won't be able to determine that without formal analysis. But Cade, I want to be very clear about something. The Park Service will not be investigating the existence of an unknown creature in Glacier. We will not be sending teams into the high country. We will not be gathering evidence or pursuing this further. Officially, this conversation never happened. People need to know," I said. "Know what?" Marcus said gently. "That there's an unknown predator in 1,000,000 acres of wilderness? That's not a warning we can responsibly give. It would shut down the park. It would create panic. And for what? Based on tracks and remains, you can't definitively connect to anything?" "Based on my eyewitness account," I said. "You were alone, exhausted, and scared," Marcus said. "I've been doing this job for a long time, Cade. I've seen patterns form in people's minds when they're isolated and stressed. I've seen good rangers begin to believe in things that weren't there, but I had seen them. I had looked into their eyes. "I'm pulling you from the valley," Marcus said. "Effective immediately. You'll be reassigned to the accessible trails near Lake McDonald. It's not punishment. It's just how this will be handled." I could have fought it. I could have gone public with the evidence. I could have contacted universities and research institutions. But standing there in that cabin, holding the skull of a person I would never know, I understood something I hadn't grasped before. The truth about what lived in these mountains was a burden too heavy to share. If I truly cared about protecting people, the best I could do was disappear into the institutional machinery, accept the reassignment, and let the mountains keep their secrets. I accepted the transfer. I moved to a ranger station near the park's entrance, where I spent my days on well-trodden trails monitoring casual hikers and writing reports on erosion patterns. For a year I was functional and numb. Then came the morning I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a photograph, printed on outdated paper and yellowed with age. It showed a ranger standing in front of a cabin with a massive bull elk. He was smiling in that serene way I had seen in the photograph of Victor Strand all those years before. But it was not Victor in the photo. It was someone I recognized from the research I'd done on missing persons in the park. A ranger named Victor Medeiros who had disappeared in 1973 from the Belly River drainage. Someone had sent me this photograph to tell me something. Someone knew what I had found. Someone knew that I had discovered not one ranger's remains in that canyon, but the beginning of a record that went back decades. I work at Glacier still. I've learned to accept the solitude again, though it's different now. I no longer come to the backcountry looking for peace. I come because I need to understand what happened to Victor Medeiros and how many others share his grave in that remote canyon. The creatures still live there. They still hunt the high country. Sometimes on clear nights I can hear them calling from the distant ridges, a sound that falls somewhere between language and hunger. The Park Service never found the skull I gave Marcus. It disappeared from the evidence locker along with all the photographs. The badge vanished as well. The only proof that any of it happened is the scar tissue in my mind, the part of me that will never be whole again. I came to Glacier seeking escape. What I found instead was something far darker, the knowledge that some places do not belong to humanity, that some corners of this earth hold secrets that should never be disturbed, and that the people who guard those places must sometimes choose between truth and the survival of those they're meant to protect. I made my choice, and I have lived with it every day since.